Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Time is almost up for Simon. He lies in his hospital bed, waiting with each passing moment the same as the last. He shares a room with other elderly people, waiting for their number to be called. He is dying. The dull room has no form of entertainment. The TV is out of order, and the radio only plays the same music from a local station, music that he does not like. If he hadn't lost the use of his legs, he would have walked out of this place long ago and waited for death in the comfort of his own home. There is no point making friends with any of the people here. Some are gone, their brains given up on them long ago. The ones who are sane could be there one moment and gone the next. Nurses closing the curtains around them before whizzing them away to the morgue. Luckily, Simon's bed is near the window. He can see the tops of the trees from the local park next to the hospital. He wishes to feel the breeze again, being so close to the seaside. Simon has many fond memories of the coastal path that scratched on the cliff's edge, hearing the seagulls call whilst the waves roll onto the hidden beaches below. A nice little town to grow old. Tea or coffee? The nurse asks, taking Simon out of his daze. Coffee, please. The coffee was awful, the bitterness too strong for his liking. But he dared say this to the nurse. She had been kind, only on the job for a week, her whole life ahead of her, while Simon's was coming to its end. Simon has no family to come and visit him. His wife passed on about 7 years ago, and his son had died whilst on a motorbike trip across Europe. He had crashed it somewhere in the Alps when he was traveling down from Switzerland to Italy on the final stretch of his tour. There were no grandchildren, for his son had not married, and Simon had no siblings as well. Simon had lived the last 5 years alone, locked away in his home. Nighttime came to the hospital, and most of the staff had gone home, leaving behind a small night staff member. Everyone in the room had been tucked away to sleep, lights turned off, and the radio set silent. Simon hates the nights in this place. For some reason, it is the most likely time for someone to die. This thought dawns on him. He would hate not to see the rising sun one last time, piercing its rays through the blinds of the window. As Simon drifts off to sleep, a gurgling sound spreads across the room. The elderly lady's bed is opposite his is dying. She is much older than Simon, her skin thinned around her skeleton, with veins poking through her flesh. The machine that is connected to her starts blaring in alarm, and an army of nurses comes racing in, trying to bring the elderly lady some comfort. Simon's view is disrupted by the green curtain being pulled. He is only left with the sounds of death. The gurgling gets louder, as if the Grim Reaper's bony hand is placed around her throat, stopping her from breathing. This goes on for around 2 minutes before the silence re-enters the room. Time of death is 2:02, says the male doctor. She is wheeled out of the room, never to be seen again. Every time this happens, Simon sits in a cold sweat, feeling the breath of death coming closer. The next morning, Simon stares at the empty bed, fresh sheets and clean tables, as if the elderly lady had never been there, ready to receive the next patient who is coming to their mortal end. The day is as usual as they come. Breakfast is usually something small, jam on toast. Then comes the family visits, which Simon passes by sleeping through, feeling jealousy of being left alone. Come evening, there's a bland dinner of supposed meat with some overly boiled vegetables. Before long, the night is here to take another. But tonight, something was not quite right. Simon has a visitor. Simon wakes from his dreary sleep. The corridor lights are still on, but his room is in darkness. Visitor time was finished hours ago, but for some reason, a man is staring at the end of Simon's bed at him. He cannot see the man properly. The room's darkness covers his face, but his presence offers a putrid smell that lingers around Simon's bed. "Who are you?" Simon asks alarmingly. The figure smiles, his needle-like teeth becoming visible, and his eyes an unnatural red. "Your time is almost up," says the figure, his breath smelling like the rotting flesh of a corpse. "Who are you?" Simon repeats. This time, his voice is a little jumpy. The figure walks a little closer, but no sounds of footsteps are heard. Simon presses the emergency button with his finger, calling for aid from the night staff. He taps the button furiously in a desperate plea to get this figure away. The figure's face is within kissing distance of Simon's. The longing stare causes Simon to push deeper into his bed to escape. "Your time is almost up." Two nurses come rushing in to find Simon laying in his bed, curled up into his pillow, crying his eyes out. He tries to speak to the nurses, but his speech comes to nothing. They hush Simon, ensure he is comfortable, and check the readings on the machine. "Get some sleep," says the older nurse, placing her cream-smoothed hand on his. Almost perfectly on time, another victim of death takes place. The elderly gentleman next to me and his family were with him earlier that day. Simon had heard them say their goodbyes. It was as if they knew he had not much time. Simon felt uncomfortable the next day. His nighttime visitor has certainly frightened him, proving that not all is explainable in this world. He ponders his thoughts. Is there an afterlife after this existence? Though Simon did not hear the voice of an angel look down on him like the vicar of his old church used to say, the figure that visited him seemed threatening and vulgar. Simon thought about his life events. If there is a hell, then that is where he will go once his soul leaves its fleshy cell. The monotonous day passes by once again, but the unwelcoming night soon comes. Simon tries his best to stay awake. He thinks that it could have been a nightmare, and if so, he doesn't want another one. Sitting up in his bed, he tries to concentrate on something to keep his mind at bay. He thinks of old songs he had sung when he was younger, books he had read, and old memories of holidays and festive occasions. But then it starts again. His mind wouldn't allow him to think of a single happy memory. Instead, his mind floods with times he wishes to forget. Sad memories, horrible memories. The time he heard the news of the death of his son. The time he watched the final breaths of his beloved wife. The bankruptcy that had almost cost him his life. Simon clenches the bedding, feeling sadness and anger grow within. "Stop it!" Simon shouts. He closes his eyes and places his hands on the top of his head. "Stop it!" Simon smacks his head, trying to make the whirling of unwanted memories finish to leave him in peace. Then, they do stop. A tear forms in his eye as it rolls down his cheek. He wipes his eye with the back of his hands, feeling a sense of relief. But the feeling of dread soon comes when he hears his name being called in a raspy voice. Simon opens his eyes to see the dark figure once again, but this time, he is not alone. Around him are young boys, heads facing the floor. "You have visitors," says the voice of the figure. Almost simultaneously, the boys lift their heads to face Simon. Their skin is of rotting flesh, and their eyes are as black as coal. "Who are they?" Simon whispers. "You don't remember." The voice turns deeper. "These are the boys who fell for your kindness. These are your victims." Simon didn't want to hear any more. He screamed, "Enough, I say!" Simon yells at the top of his voice. The tall figure and the 3 boys walk around the bed. Again, not a footstep heard. All 4 figures stand over Simon as he lies, stuck to his bed. In a split second, all of them show an awful smile. Razor-sharp, pin-like teeth, mouths stretching an unnatural length. The figures dive onto Simon, chomping down on his flesh. He feels the agony as his blood pumps through his veins, pushing at their heads. As if like hungry dogs, their jaws are locked on. The strong stench of death grows, causing Simon to wrinkle and gag. The hospital staff come rushing in to see Simon once again in a cold sweat. His heart rate is through the roof, and his breathing is heavy. Simon screams, waking the other patients who were fast asleep in their beds just a moment ago. Once again, the staff try to calm him down. "Come on, Simon. You need to sleep," says the male doctor. "I don't want to sleep. I don't want to sleep." The next day, Simon could feel the pain in his arms and legs from where the figures had bit down on him. When he searched his skin for any wounds, he could see no redness, no punctures, nothing. The same day passes again, almost as if Simon can predict what will happen next. He grew to like these uninteresting days. At least he's safe. He is alive. The thought of death fears him more now. He believes something horrible is waiting for him on the other side. Around 4 o'clock, it was the family's final hour of visiting time. As he watches the people around the room, a young child wanders away and stands next to Simon. "Hello," says Simon in a confused manner. "Tonight's the night you will die," says the child in an emotional way, with no expression on his face, just a blank stare. His parents came to pull him away. "Sorry," says the mother. The child's emotions return to him. He has forgotten that he had spoken to Simon as he skips around the room and kisses his grandpa. At 5 o'clock, the families are escorted from the room. 6 o'clock, dinner is served. Once again, the same boring hospital food, vegetables, and a bit of meat. From 7 to 9 o'clock, the ones who are sane sit there bored, looking around the room as life goes on. Around 9 is time for bed, the time Simon has been dreading most. The nurse came around with a new drug for him to take. This was unusual, as he'd been on the same prescription for 2 weeks. "These will help you sleep," says the young nurse. Simon puts up a fuss. "I will not be taking these," he shouts, trying to knock the cup from her hand. They eventually do get the sleeping tablets into Simon. They are done with him waking up in the middle of the night screaming. It puts everyone on edge, especially the other patients. Simon can feel the drug take effect in his body almost instantly. He struggles to keep his eyes open as they grow heavier. His head nods uncontrollably. He is scared. He knows that death is coming for him tonight. He looks desperately around the room one last time. No one will help him now. Simon wakes up from his sleep, but not in the hospital bed. He wakes up in a field, somewhere in the heart of what he believes is England. Using his legs as come back as, for the first time in nearly a year, he can stand and walk again. The field has no special features. A small collection of trees sits at the bottom, and a structure sits in the next field over. The sky is a featureless gray. Something draws Simon towards the structure in the next field. Memories start coming, and he feels like he recognizes the place, but it still hasn't returned to him. How am I here? Simon questions himself. Have I died? Upon reaching the structure, he can see that it is used for storage. He opens the door, which is a little heavy but manageable. Inside is a workbench, some tools, and an old tractor that's collecting dust. Nothing special. He feels the splintered wood of the table. Something doesn't feel right or horrible. A feeling of dread. Seconds pass faster. The gray clouds turn a burnt orange as a figure in all black is seen standing in the center of the field. Simon stands in the doorway, stares at the figure for a moment, and recognizes him immediately. The figure has visited him in the hospital. The figure starts to walk towards Simon hastily, causing Simon to jump with fright. Frantically closing the door to the shed, hoping it is enough to keep that strange man outside. The few moments of silence are interrupted by the bang of a door, then a second bang, soon followed by a third. "Go away!" screams Simon, who is now curling up on the floor next to the workbench. "You cannot run from your past this time, Simon." The door unlocks itself and swings slightly open, letting in the orange glow. A pale hand comes from behind the door, nails unkept and gaping flesh turning an unhealthy brown. The figure pushes the door open and walks in. Again, not a footstep is heard. "Who are you?" Simon cries. The figure stands over Simon and looks down, no pity on his face. "I am your past." Simon didn't understand what he meant by that. The 3 young boys who visited him in the hospital walked in individually. Once again, their heads are bowed, not looking in Simon's direction. I don't know what you mean," Simon pleads. "Oh, you must remember Simon and these boys." Simon looks at them as their heads lift slowly. He still doesn't know. His mind has faded over the years, and a slight memory loss took effect on him a year ago. He especially struggles with faces. Here stands Arthur Bentley, Chris Pennance, and Tony Gibbon. 3 boys who you have killed, says the raspy voice. The names sounded familiar, names that Simon had not heard since his younger life. Fractions of his memories come back to him. "Oh, no," Simon whispers. "You remember," says the figure with a sinister smile. "That was a long time ago. I'm not that man anymore. I have found Christ. I ask for his forgiveness every day and night." Simon couldn't control himself. He spoke fast, pleading with the figure. The figure laughs. "You have never paid for your crimes. You have gone unnoticed. This part is true. Simon has never faced any charge for murdering these boys. He hid the bodies so well, deep in the fields of unsuspecting farmers, far away from where the crime had taken place. This was also back in the 50s and 60s, when forensic science wasn't how it is today. You tricked these boys, playing as an innocent man. They needed your help. They were lost on the country roads, and they trusted you. The voice grew deeper and deeper. I'm sorry, Simon begs. You took them in your van and you brought them here. You did unspeakable things to their innocence. I know, Simon cries. You got away with it in life. You had plenty of time to pay for your sins, but you cowardly did not. You lived a long life. That's why we took away your wife and your son, so that you can be alone. Simon cries more, crawling to the feet of the figure, begging with all his might to be spared. He is sorry for the crimes he had done. The figure kicks Simon away with his feet. Now you must pay for your sins in death. The figure turns around and walks toward the door, leaving the three boys standing over Simon. They start to breathe heavily, fingers twisting and turning in a terrifying manner, like dogs waiting for the order to bite. You will now pay. The voice turned to its deepest yet, letting off an almost echo. With that, the doors to the outside close shut, leaving Simon and the three boys in complete darkness. A snarl and a screech can be heard, 3 sets of eyes glowing red, and a hyena's laugh coming from each of the children. Before Simon could have the chance to fend for himself, his legs lost their use once again, making him unable to move. The 3 eyes come closer before he feels the stinging pinch of puncturing teeth in his flesh. One by one, they rip at it, tearing the flesh from his bone. Simon screams in agony. He is repenting to God, but God isn't listening. While the flesh of his arms and legs are gone, they go for his stomach and head. The pain is too much. Though Simon cannot faint, he must feel every bite. When his flesh is gone, he is still alive and conscious. He feels his flesh growing back and again goes through the same torment. Simon's existence in the underworld is to be ripped apart repeatedly, a horrible pain for all eternity. His crime is being paid most brutally.
When I was growing up, my family had issues with trespassers. Not something you expect to deal with when your home sits along the shores of a secluded lake, hidden deep within the woods. Even more surprising when your neighbors are all members of your own extended family. Yet, trespassers were a regular occurrence for my family. Unsettling encounters with strangers in the woods, a mere fact of life that my cousins and I became familiar with by the time we were school age. Most trespassers were easy to explain. Lost hikers were the most common due to our proximity to a national park and its meandering trails. They found their way on our property by accident and were always happy for assistance and directions on how to get back to the park. Then there were the people who trespassed intentionally. It was well known in the nearby towns that our family's rather extensive property held within its borders some interesting bits of history and local lore. Researchers, writers, treasure hunters, and similar folk all made appearances, each hoping to find something interesting, some artifact or inspiration to help them make a name for themselves. While these encounters could be annoying, sometimes even a bit tense when the offenders refused to leave, they too were rarely cause for concern. That wasn't the case with the trespasser my cousins and I called the Gray Man. Any meeting with him was always something to be afraid of. The Gray Man got his name from the fact that while everyone had seen him at least once or twice, the descriptions of him were all vague and muddled. When our parents would question any of us kids after an encounter to figure out what we saw, the explanations always went the same way. The child had seen a man in the woods that made no sound, said no words, and didn't resemble anything. What was he wearing? We kids could never remember. What color hair did he have? We kids could never say. All we could ever describe was the dread he made us feel, and that his appearance was some hazy, murky gray. Our parents began calling these stories encounters with the Gray Man, and the title stuck. I had more than a few run-ins with the Gray Man throughout my childhood, but the one I'm going to share here today was the most unsettling. When you live in a lake, swimming is part of summer life. It's not just because of the entertainment and the exercises, but because it's a great way to keep cool during the long runs of humid 97-degree days, 36 degrees Celsius for the rest of you. With all the time we spent swimming, my cousins and I became as comfortable in the water as we were on land. We grew fearless of the depths below, ignorant of the dangers, always pushing to venture further and further from the shore whenever our parents weren't looking. The biggest rite of passage was swimming to the old fishing raft on the opposite end of the lake. One leg of the swim was just under a half-mile if you cut right across the lake at its center, 1 mile round trip. By the time I was 14, I'd made the swim to the fishing raft a handful of times, always in the company of others, usually my cousins. Unfortunately, that was the year I decided to try it on my own. Over the summer, I'd been captivated by the coverage of the Olympics, specifically the triathlon. I was a lanky kid who had grown tall but forgot to fill out, too easily pushed around to be competitive in sports like football, basketball, or soccer. But I could run for days and swim better than any of the kids in my class. For my adolescent brain, it felt like a calling, a sign that I was meant to train and become an Olympic triathlete. Armed only with what I'd learned from Bob Costas during the TV coverage, I built out my plan to begin my training. From the Olympics, I'd gathered that the swimming portion they did was about the same distance as going to the fishing raft and back. So I decided I'd start sneaking out of the house before dawn, make the swim when the waters were calm, and be back before anyone noticed I was missing. That first night, I even slept in my suit. I was so excited to start my journey toward greatness. That morning I woke up early, 5:30 a.m., just before sunrise, and crept down the stairs and out of the house without being noticed. I made my way down to the water's edge and gazed out over the lake before me, a pane of mirrored glass, smooth and unbroken. A light mist drifted around the shoreline like a halo, where the warm lake water mixed with the cool air from the forest floor. It created a pillow that muffled sound, painting the scene with peace and tranquility. The world was calm as I broke the surface, slipped into the water, and began my swim. The first half of my debut practice run across the lake was uneventful. I was familiar with the swim, and I was confident in my ability to make it. With about 1/4 remaining until I reached the raft and my midway turn, the electric jolt of a cramp struck my hamstring. I lurched in the water, floundering briefly, then righted myself and fought through the pain as I did a quick analysis of my situation. The raft was closer. Making it there would allow me to get out of the water to rest and stretch my hamstring. Heading to the raft, however, would leave me with a farther swim home once I was able to recover. If the cramp came back, I could be in real trouble. Though if I turned now and tried to make it back without a break, I'd be putting myself at risk of drowning for sure. I decided to take the shorter route to safety, shifted my body into a backstroke, and continued my way to the raft. I reached the raft just barely, gulping water and struggling to stay afloat. I clawed my way up the rusted ladder like a shipwrecked rat, sprawling across a splintered, weather-worn docktop. I lay there like that for at least 10 minutes, eyes to the heavens, gasping for air. As I breathed in deeply, my exhaustion dissipated, only to slowly be replaced by a different tingling sense. Despite the sun now shining down and warming me, I could feel goosebumps forming across my arms and legs. Was it my brushwood drowning that had me set on edge? No, that wasn't what was gnawing at me. A feeling that I wasn't alone anymore filled up my insides until I could hardly stand it. I was suddenly acutely aware that I was being watched. Against my nerves, I forced myself to abruptly sit up and search the shoreline for whom or what had triggered my alarm bells. I spotted the cause in an instant. At the place where the forest met the water, a figure stood in the mist. The gray man was watching me there. The only thing that separated us was the 30 or so yards of water between the raft and shore. The two of us remained like that, me seated on the raft, the gray man on the shore, as we studied each other. That was the longest unobstructed look I even got of the gray man, and I'm still at a loss for how to describe him. He was like a shadow with depth and weight. He had hair, but I couldn't tell you the color. He had features in his face, a nose, a mouth, but I couldn't tell you if they were distinguished or petite. He had eyes, but I couldn't tell you what color. He wore clothes, but I couldn't tell you their style. It was just there, a suggestion of a man, lacking the definition to make him complete. I was locked in an internal struggle, my mind fighting to make sense of what it was seeing, when the gray man stepped his foot forward from shore and plunged it into the lake. As it entered, the water bubbles churned, and droplets splashed down in utter silence. There was no sound. Then he stepped in again, and in muted motions began to wade toward me, and my haven upon the raft. As the gray man approached, inching deeper and deeper with each step, he did not attempt to swim. He continued forward in a march, feet firm upon the lake bed. The deeper he got, the more the water rose to his waist, then his chest, then his shoulders. Still the gray man pushed forward. Still 15 yards away from the raft, the gray man's head slipped below the water. A final ripple, and then there was nothing. I waited as the mirror-like tranquility slowly returned to the surface of the lake. Uneasy at the change in atmosphere, I jumped to my feet, attempting to center myself on the raft, feeling in that moment more exposed, vulnerable, and trapped than I had ever felt before. In anticipation of an attack, I frantically searched around the raft's edges, looking for fingers and hands, reaching up to pull the gray man to the surface. All I could picture in my head was the final scene in Friday the 13th, the first one, where Jason bursts up from the water and grabs a hold of a lone survivor as she sits in a boat, pulling her down to her death. I knew any minute that the same end would come for me. Yet time marched on and nothing happened. An impossible amount of time, far too long, for a person to remain submerged. They say time ticks by slowly in moments of crisis, but even so, I knew that it had to be long enough that any man would have needed to come up for air by now. Where was the gray man? I turned my search back to the shore. Had he retreated there while I was distracted, with my search around the raft? If the gray man didn't make a sound when he entered the water, maybe he had left in the same silence. Could he be gone? That was something that I desperately wanted to believe. But I just couldn't convince myself it was true. He was still down there in the depths below waiting for me. As the sun rose high and reached midday, it beat down on me. I began to despair. How long could I remain here before I needed to force an attempt to swim back home? I could feel the sweat being pulled out of my body by humidity that wrapped me and weighed on me like a blanket. I was already starting to get dehydrated, yet I was surrounded by fresh water I didn't dare attempt to drink. I knew the moment I cupped my hands in the water, the trap would be sprung and I'd be pulled under. I was stuck there, able to see my house but unable to do anything to save myself. Legs aching, throat bone dry, fear consuming me, yet all I could do was wait and hope someone spotted me and came to my rescue. It was near dinner time, 12 hours after I set out that morning, before my cousin made his way down to the opposite lakeshore. My initial screams for help were dry, hoarse, pathetic yelps, but eventually I got out a few good yells and caught his attention enough that he looked my way and could see me jumping and waving to him from across the lake. Minutes later, I saw him and my uncle hop in their fishing boat to make their way across to where I stood stranded. That was the longest period for me, when hope crept back inside me, but rescue still seemed so far off. When they reached me, I yammered off about how I'd cramped up during my swim. My uncle scolded me for being so stupid to swim out this far alone. When I began to mention the gray man, my uncle flashed me a skeptical, accusing look, then motioned around his arms, held wide as if to say, "There's nothing here, you crazy kid." I climbed up quickly at that point. Kids have an odd fear of adults not believing them. It's as if their own eyes are less reliable than adult logic. Once I was on the boat myself, I even began to feel silly about how I acted. The sheer amount of time had I wasted on that raft. I worried about something lurking in the water the whole time, perfectly safe to dive in and swim home whenever I wanted. How much had I suffered because my mind ran wild with horror movie scenarios? As we pulled away and began the trip home, a hit of hysterical laughter began to bubble out of me. I laughed at myself, the stupidity of my irrational actions, and the absurdity of the situation I'd put myself in. That laughter died in my throat the moment I looked back at the raft. Directly beneath it, between the barrel pontoons that kept it afloat, was a head extended above the water. The gray man had been there below me, less than a foot away, waiting for me the whole time. If I had done anything other than what I did, made any different choices, he would have had me. I grabbed at my uncle excitedly, pointing at the raft, begging him to look at what was there, but by the time he turned to follow my direction, there was nothing to be seen. The gray man had vanished again. That night I struggled to sleep. A full day spent unprotected and exposed under the harsh sun had taken its toll. My sunburn had already begun to blister, and I knew the next few days would be miserable. That night the pain wouldn't even allow me to lie down on my bed. Instead, I stood in the darkness of my room, looking out the window. The moon was full, bathing the lake in light nearly as crisp as daytime. Under the moonlight, I could see clear across the lake and spotted the raft. Upon it, I saw a shadow-like figure standing there, looking back at me.
My name is George Hart, and I'm a true native New Yorker, born and raised in the great Empire State. My mother, Maria, gave birth to me right here in the Bronx, over at the Lincoln Medical Center. I was told it was during a record cold spell on a frigid February morning back in '38. I grew up in the South Bronx in one of those old 5-storied apartment buildings right off Lafayette Avenue. One of those decrepit-looking brick-faced apartment buildings that are practically erected right on top of each other, like the ones on television, where the guys are running from building to building on the rooftops and leaping off to the next roof in a single bound. I always hated having all those buildings built so close to each other. So close that the residents could run a clothesline from their window to the building next door, cramming as much living space as possible into that one block. Yet, here I am again. My mother recently passed away 2 months after my 43rd birthday. I got the call up at work. I was working at a buddy's garage up in Yonkers at the time. The police told me it looked as if she had had a heart attack, died in her sleep. Never knew Mom as having a bad ticker, but shit happens, as they say. After the funeral, I decided to head back to the Bronx from Yonkers and move into our old apartment. The rent was a lot cheaper, and Raymond, whose garage I was working at, had made a phone call and gotten me a job at a garage that was only a few blocks away from the old place near Randall Avenue. The Lord taketh away, and he giveth. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of 5 and faced the street out front. I left most of the things in the apartment the way they were when I moved back in. Even left Mom's room the way it was. I felt bad just at the thought of getting rid of any of her stuff, so I left her room be. I wound up settling into my old bedroom. The bed seemed to have shrunk considerably since I was in it last, my feet hanging just over the edge of the mattress. Once I saved up a few bucks, I'd have to look into replacing the bed. I made a mental note to myself of making that one of my first priorities. It took me until the beginning of May before I was finally feeling settled in at both the old apartment and the new job. I even made the acquaintance of a couple of my neighbors in the building. There was an old black couple up on the 5th floor, Horace and Sophia Coogan. They were somewhere in their late 60s, real nice people. They had been living here for the longest time. When I mentioned to them that I was Maria's son, they said they remembered me as a small boy, even though I had no recollection of them. Either way, good people. Then there was a Puerto Rican girl on the floor below me, Lucinda Estevez. I never asked how old she was, as that's just something you never ask a woman, so I'd have to just guesstimate that she was somewhere in her late 30s. Beautiful woman, with olive-colored skin and long black hair and big dark eyes. I had run into her several times prior as we were getting mail from our mailboxes downstairs before I finally got up the nerve to start up a conversation. She lived alone and had moved in just over a year before me. As May was sliding by and summer was getting ready to make its scorching grand entrance into the ghettos of the Bronx, Horace asked me one day if I wouldn't mind looking at their car. He could only describe the problem with their old blue Pinto as not running right. I felt obligated as a neighbor and a mechanic to take a gander beneath the hood and see what was cooking. It was during that overcast Saturday afternoon when I went out to the street with my toolbox that I first became aware of the night crawler. Old Horace must have felt a little guilty having me out there at the curb looking under the hood by myself. Or maybe Sophia had coaxed him out there to keep me company as I gave the engine a going over. He stood leaning against the car with his hands crammed in his pockets, gazing up at the neighboring apartment buildings that lined our street.
"Gonna be a hot summer,"
he stated to no one in particular as his eyes scanned the facades of the surrounding buildings.
"Uh-huh. Nightcrawler gonna have a grand old time this year."
"To who?" I asked from under the hood as I was checking the spark plug tips.
"The Nightcrawler,"
he repeated nonchalantly.
"Your mama never told you about her?"
"I can't say she ever did. Who is she? Some homeless lady? Otis chuckled at my inquiry.
No, I wish that was all she was. She come out every summer hoping to find some poor soul with the windows wide open on a hot summer night.
His statement had drawn my curiosity, and I emerged from under the hood while still running a folded piece of sandpaper between a plug's electrode and arm. What? Otis turned his eyes from the urban landscape and faced me.
Some folk think it's just some silly urban legend, but I seen it with my own 2 eyes, so I know better. You'll find none of my windows open at night during the summer. No, sir, and I'd advise you to do the same.
I was the one chuckling now. What are you talking about? He leaned closer and lowered his tone slightly as a woman and her 3 kids passed us on the sidewalk.
They say there's an old Haitian woman who lives here in the Bronx. Exactly where, I don't know, nor do I want to. Come over on a boat a long time ago. They say she's a mambo.
Mambo? I now found myself leaning on the car next to him. The engine was a distant memory.
A voodoo priestess. They say she's older than you, me, and Sophia all put together. She's still alive after all this time because of that nightcrawler. She sent it out on a summer night to suck the life out of people while they sleep. Then it crawls back to her before the sun rises and breathes the life of those folks into her. That will keep her alive for so long.
I found the yarn that Horace was spinning as entertaining as it was captivating, and went along with his fabricated story. So exactly what is this, nightcrawler?
Well, to be honest, the nightcrawler is what I call it. Its true name is Le Rodier.
Le. I struggled to repeat the foreign word.
Le Rodier. It's a French word. Means something that creeps or prowls around, or something of the sort. Shit, I'm not French. That's why I call it the nightcrawler. Anyway, this thing looks something like a big black spider, but it's not really a spider exactly. It has part of a woman mixed in there. Something that priestess called up from some hole in hell.
A spider? Mixed with a woman? His imagination was without limits.
Only way I can describe it. I didn't believe in all that bullshit voodoo mumbo-jumbo either, till I saw it myself. It was about 5 or 6 summers ago. I woke up in the middle of the night to take a piss. When you get old, you find yourself always having to piss. Anyway, as most folks do here in the summer who can't afford an air conditioner or the electric bill that come with it, they leave the windows wide open all night, hoping that some kind of breeze blows in during the night to offer a little relief from the heat while they're sleeping.
I nodded as I listened. I recalled how my mother had always kept the windows wide open at night during the summer, even with one of those small isolating fans going all night long. I remembered just lying there in the dark, spread eagle on the sheets, and nothing but my skivvies trying to cool off from the stifling heat.
Well, I was standing there in front of the John pissing and looking out the small window above it. At first I thought I was seeing things, but after rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I found out I wasn't. I saw this giant spider crawling on the building across the way. It blended in with the night shadows and was as silent as the grave as it moved. I watched it scurry about along the side of the wall, checking each window it came upon. When it stopped at an open one, it crawled right into that apartment. Not sure how long I stood there at the John watching out the window, but it was sometime long after I'd finished pissing when it came back out and crawled off to the back of the building. Later the next day, come to find out that Mr. Jackson was found dead in that apartment.
I realized just how distracting the story had become and moved back to the engine. I didn't want to spend all afternoon under the hood on my Saturday. That was probably just a coincidence. Like you said, it was dark and there were shadows, and you had just awakened. A perfect combination to be seeing hallucinations.
Hallucinations, my dick. I know what I saw. The thing was like some spider woman crawling about the sides of the buildings at night looking for an open window, so it can creep in and suck the life out of someone in their sleep. If you're smart, you'll take my...
Horace!
Sophia was calling down from their window 5 floors up.
Come on up for lunch. Got soup and a sandwich waiting for you.
Just keep your windows closed at night, George. At least until summer passes.
With his parting words, Horace pulled himself from off the car and patted my shoulder as he shuffled into the building. As I was checking and cleaning the other spark plugs, I found myself still smiling at his urban legend and how seriously he took it. I thought about how hot their apartment must get in the summer at night, with only a small fan going and all the windows sealed because of one old superstitious man. I laughed out loud and shook my head as I continued with my task. Just like Horace had predicted that Saturday afternoon, summer had come early with a blazing introduction. The sweltering humidity seemed to linger all day, making the simple act of breathing a laborious effort, and still it mocked and defied you as it remained even in the dark of night. During the past couple of weeks I had become closer with Lucinda, and we saw more of one another other than outside of just bumping into each other at the mailbox. On a couple of occasions, we even went out to a local bar down the street for a couple of beers. In that time, we had become comfortable enough with each other to exchange apartment keys. Not that there was nothing serious going on between us, but we just trusted one another enough to hold on to each other's key just in case we got locked out. It was easier this way instead of waking up the building super late at night just to tell him you were locked out. It had been just over a month after we exchanged keys when it happened. I had come home late one Friday night from the garage, and the heat of that day just seemed to drain the strength from me. You know the feeling. All I wanted to do when I walked in that door was flop on the couch and knock back a few cold beers and watch some television. I eventually wound up calling Lucinda to see if she wanted to hang out and share a few drinks. Maybe even go down to the bar where there was air conditioning. But there was no answer at her place. Probably out on a date or with some friends. I decided to make the best of the evening and settled for some cold cores and back-to-back episodes of The Honeymooners. I couldn't tell you what time I had fallen asleep. One minute I was 5 beers in, watching Ralph and Norton preparing to buy a hot dog stand, and the next, I was sound asleep. Something, though, had awakened me from my clammy slumber sometime past midnight. I slowly opened my eyes and saw that there was nothing on the television now but static. The network was done for the night, and the apartment was dark. As I laid there on the couch with my clothes sticking to me with sweat, I debated if I should jump in the shower and try to cool off before I went to my bed for the rest of the night. Before I could come to any conclusion on the matter, the noise that had initially awakened me came again. A creaking of a floorboard. It came from the kitchen behind the couch. Now, I had grown up in this apartment and knew it as well as one might an old close friend. I knew which windows leaked cold drafts in the winter, which wall sockets worked and which didn't, and especially what areas of the hardwood floor creaked when stepped upon. I gently closed my eyes and feigned sleep as I awaited my next move. The floor creaked again ever so slightly as pressure was placed on its surface. Someone had somehow managed to get into my apartment. I racked my brain for anything close at hand that I could use as a weapon. I strained on picturing a mental image of my surrounding area on the couch, and I couldn't find nothing that would aid me in a fight. Empty beer cans and a TV remote weren't cutting the mustard. I thought if I were to perhaps suddenly fly off the couch screaming like some madman that it would give me the element of surprise and maybe even the upper hand. But that notion was swept aside when I now felt a weight being applied to the couch itself. Was somebody climbing onto the couch with me? I slowly allowed my eyelids to part, as I could no longer cluelessly lay there oblivious to what was taking place. I damn near screamed and pissed myself. Though my eyes were beholding what was squatting over me, my mind was mentally screaming that this could not be reality, but a horrifying nightmare that I could not awaken from. The ghastly monstrosity was directly over me, balanced partially on both the couch and the floor. I instantly recognized it as some giant man-sized spider. 4 of its long segmented legs were perched on the back of the couch while the other 4 rested on the floor between the TV and I. The foul creature was huge and black with splashes of gray mixed into its body, giving it superb camouflage for its nighttime patrols amongst the shadows. The most hideous aspect of this abomination was its head. Horace was indeed correct about it being a female. A human head was fixed where the spider's face should have been. A haggard-looking gray face of a woman with long, matted black hair that dangled about my face. The eyes in the ungodly face were a milky white, all 4 of them. 2 more smaller eyes bulged from the forehead. The misshapen mouth was even more grotesque. 2 small infant-like arms stretched from the sides of its neck and constantly moved about, its tiny pointed fingers grasping at the air and its little hands playfully touching the creature's dripping maw. As I had said, I did not scream. I couldn't. But I sure as hell pissed myself, though. I was literally paralyzed with fear as I lay there in sweat and urine. The face loomed closer, and the spider's sternum lowered itself onto me, and I could now feel its weight. The tiny hands reached out and began to gently stroke my face as it was lining its mouth directly onto mine. I was about to have the life sucked out of me, and they would find me sprawled out dead on the couch in the morning, just like that Mr. Jackson fellow.
George?
Someone was calling my name outside my door and began knocking louder than one should.
George, you up? I forgot my key.
My God, not her. Please don't let it take her. I mentally cried as the sudden noise startled it, causing it to lift itself off me. The head turned towards the door as Lucinda called my name again and knocked.
I'm gonna come in and get my key, okay? I hope you're decent.
I could hear her fumbling my spare key into the door's lock. The face turned back to meet mine, and the little hands again caressed my face. Soon. It spoke in a gurgled hiss, and in one quick movement it was off both me and the couch. As the front door swung open, I heard it brush against the kitchen window frame on its way out, rattling the glass pane as it passed through. Even as Lucinda walked in and saw me lying on the couch surrounded by beer cans and in my piss-stained pants, I still couldn't move. What I had just experienced was so surreal that my mind was still trying to sort through what had just happened when she looked down at me in disgust.
Jesus Christ, George, what the fuck? Look at yourself,
was all she said as she walked over to the wall and pulled her key off the nail it hung from. She looked down at me again, shook her head in disappointment, and scoffed before she walked out. Still, I just laid there in a hot mess and in silence. I could only imagine the sight I must have been. It took me a good 10 minutes to process everything that had occurred and chalked it up to something that was dreadfully real and not some baneful dream. When I finally accepted the ordeal as pure fact, I recalled the one word that thing spoke before it scurried back out the window. Soon. It was then I leapt from the couch and began closing and securing all the windows to the apartment, as well as closing all the shades. As the reality of my experience soaked in, my legs and hands began to shake. I reached into the cabinet above the sink and pulled out a bottle of the hard stuff. I must confess that I had never been so scared in all my life, and I turned on every light in the apartment, then sat at that kitchen table all night, pulling off that bottle until the sun rose. Only then did I move to my bedroom and succumb to a restless sleep. I awoke the next morning with the notion that last night's events were in no way accurate and just a far-off dream. The idea was almost accepted until I sat up, still in yesterday's clothes, and saw the front of my pants were still damp with piss. With it being daylight and the temperature already rising, I pulled myself from my bed and showered. The whole time I stood under the cool cascade of water, I tried to tell myself that it couldn't have been real. After changing into some fresh clothes, I finished what was left of the bottle and went up to see Horace. To my luck, Sophia had run out to do some food shopping, leaving Horace and myself alone for the time being. Before I could unload my experience onto him, he poured us each a shot of blackberry brandy. He said that by the look on my face, I needed it. It was after the third shot that I told him of last night's encounter. There were times where I stammered through my story, and at one point almost cried, but with much difficulty and 2 more shots of brandy, I finally concluded my tale.
Sound to me like that young girl saved your ass last night.
He finally said.
It also sounds like the Nightcrawler isn't through with you yet.
What do you mean?
If that thing told you soon, what you think that means, huh? Sound to me like she's gonna be paying you another visit.
But why? I was already starting to sweat despite the old box fan that was mounted in the window, which was failing to blow any cool air into the room.
You denied it a life, and you got a pretty good look at it, I guess. Only thing I can tell you, George, is you was one lucky motherfucker. And you owe that girl downstairs, even though she has no idea what she did.
Yeah, I guess I do. I stood up and set the shot glass on an end table near my chair. I've got to get going, Horace. I'm still having a hard time swallowing all this. I need to do some thinking.
You do all the thinking you need to. And most of all, make sure your windows are locked up every night now.
He also stood and walked me to the door. Every summer night since then, I closed and secured all the windows religiously. I didn't give a damn how hot it got in that tiny apartment. Those windows stayed shut. It took me the rest of that summer before I stopped closing my blinds at night. Eventually, my life began to slowly resume its normal day-to-day activities, and I started talking to Lucinda again. You see, after that night, she avoided me, and had even given me back the key to my place. She must have thought I was some drunken vagrant after what she saw that night. I never mentioned what really happened, and never will. After that day up in Horace's apartment, I never spoke a word of it again, and Horace never brought up the subject. Sometimes over the last few summers, while I laid there in bed on those sweltering nights, laying spread eagle in my skivvies just as I had done as a child, I would catch a glimpse of some dark shadow moving quietly past one of my windows. I didn't try to summon up some reasonable explanation to the shape or begin to deny what was really out there crawling around, because I knew exactly what it was. Le Rodier, the Nightcrawler. During its late night prowling about the city, it was occasionally making a detour just to see if I had let down my guard and accidentally left a window open. Last summer, Horace passed away. No, not by the Nightcrawler. He still kept his windows closed every summer like clockwork. He had tripped carrying a bag of groceries up the steep stairs to his apartment. The poor bastard broke his neck in the fall. Killed him instantly, some say. I was at work when it occurred and found out from Lucinda later that day as we met at our mailboxes. A month later, Sophia moved away and was staying with family down in North Carolina. As for Lucinda, we gradually started hanging out once more and even exchanged keys again. The Lord taketh away, and he giveth. Things were finally starting to fall back into a comfortable state of normality. I even spent some money I had stashed away for a new couch and bought an air conditioner for Lucinda. I never forgot what Horace had said about me owing that girl for her unexpected arrival that night and saving my ass from a horrible death. The least I could do was give her a reason to close her windows in summer. I think my gift won me major brownie points because we're going out next weekend for dinner. This relationship may just be ready to progress to the next level. I was coming home from that bar down the street where Lucinda and I used to frequent, only this time I was out celebrating one of my co-workers' birthdays. All the guys from the garage were there. Despite the day's earlier heat, there was a slight breeze in the air that night, and it felt good as I walked home. The pleasantry was short-lived, though, as I entered my building and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. I was sweating like a whore in church by the time I reached my door. As soon as I walked in and closed the door behind me, I could tell she had been in my apartment. Her perfume still lingered in the air as I walked into the darkened confines inside. The only light on was the overhead light above the stove. A folded piece of paper was neatly placed on the stove's surface. My name was written across it. I was already smiling as I unfolded the paper and read the handwritten note. George, I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate the air conditioner and how much I appreciate you. We've really come a long way since you first moved in. To show you how much I appreciate your efforts, I bought a bottle of wine and will probably have started it by the time you read this. How about coming downstairs and helping me finish it? Lucinda. P.S. I opened a few of the windows to let some air in. There's a beautiful breeze out tonight. How you can have them closed all summer is beyond me. My smile faded as quickly as it had formed, and the letter slipped from my fingers. I could only stare straight ahead as I heard something shifting in the room's darkness. It pushed aside a chair behind me as it was moving closer. A black shadow began to fall over me. I closed my eyes as tightly as possible. Finally! The gurgled hiss spat into my ear. This time, I did scream.
I never thought that dying would save my life. But then, death has always been a funny son of a bitch. 3 weeks ago, I made an appointment to see my regular doctor about an annoying cough that wouldn't go away. Got so bad, I swore that Gary, the guy who sat in the cubicle next to me at work, wanted to strangle me with my own phone cord. I didn't like him much either, so I considered us even. I walked into my doctor's office, figuring I'd gotten myself another case of bronchitis. I expected to walk out in 5 minutes with a prescription for the good cough medicine that makes me feel all warm and squishy as I drift off in front of the TV. She insisted on an X-ray, though, so I humored her, figuring I didn't have much choice if I wanted to walk out with that precious slip of paper. They say the quickest way to a man's heart is with radiation, I joked, and she laughed her way out of the room. But when she walked in a little later, with a developed X-ray in hand, she wasn't laughing. She popped the film sheet into the holding clips and flipped the light switch, revealing the black and white image of my lungs, specifically the gray cloud that had settled over them, like the weather at a doomed parade. I'm no trained professional, but the crowd of dark spots gathered in my lungs didn't look right to me. Non-small cell lung cancer is what it's called, though to me, non-small sounds like a nice way of saying big and scary. And yet they said I was lucky, that they caught it early enough to give me a fighting chance, so long as we took what they called an aggressive plan of attack. Let me tell you, I did not feel lucky. There isn't enough TV in the world to distract you from a diagnosis like that. Pretty soon your thoughts start to turn in on themselves. You analyze and reanalyze every choice and cringe-inducing mistake you've ever made. More than anything, my mind kept returning to all those times I'd lectured my parents about their pack-a-day smoking habit. I'd leave them informational flyers and email them links to support groups. It might be cool if you don't die, I'd tell them. Maybe stick around for a bit, just to see how it goes. I eventually gave up when I realized they were never going to change. and I was somehow becoming the bad guy for trying to keep my parents alive. Well, guess what? Those assholes retired to Florida with a clean bill of health, and they left me holding the check. Or, more accurately, the medical bill. We might have been blood, but it had slowly become bad blood. They were the reason I didn't carry a phone anymore, so I didn't have to live with the possibility of a surprise phone call. I didn't even bother calling to tell them about my diagnosis. Either I would do that when the treatments were over, to celebrate my victory over their second-hand gift to me, or my obituary would be the greatest I told you so in modern-day history. You can call it petty. I call it something to look forward to. When I signed in for my first chemo session, the girl who handed me the dictionary-sized stack of paperwork to fill out asked if I had someone to drive me home. I thought it was a pretty stupid question on account of us living in a city, where public transportation is always about 10 feet away. Seeing the look on my face, she explained that chemo takes a lot out of a person. I think that's the idea, I said. When she missed the obvious, and some would say brilliant, joke, and went to describe the feelings of nausea and exhaustion I might experience as a side effect of the treatment, I could see she wasn't going to let the subject go easily. Being that I was already experiencing nausea and exhaustion, I did the right thing and lied to her face. "Don't worry," I said. "An old friend will be waiting to pick me up." If it makes you feel any better, it wasn't a total lie. I consider the A-train to be a very old, very dear, very smelly, and very piss-stained friend. After filling out all that paperwork, I never wanted to use my arm again, which was right about the time a nurse brought me to the infusion room and told me we'd be using my arm for the treatment. My oncologist showed up, who I found to be a man who had never smiled in his life. He told me I'd be receiving my own personalized blend of chemo and pre-medications, including anti-nausea meds, anxiety meds, allergy meds, and steroids. I asked him if he could add a shot of whiskey to that cocktail, but the joke went over like a cardboard flamethrower. When the doctor, with the fantastic sense of humor, left, the nurse hooked me up to the poison drip and gave me a few tips about how I might feel. She said the steroids might give me energy, while the allergy and anti-anxiety drugs might make me sleepy. "So an 8-ball, I said. When she gave me a confused look, I added, "Coke and heroin, the only way to party." "Hopefully it's not that strong," she said. And what about this stuff?" I asked, nodding to the clear liquid dripping into my bloodstream. "How will that make me feel?" "Usually not great, but it makes the cancer cells feel even worse." I could certainly agree with that kind of logic. "The enemy of my enemy," I said. And finally, she smiled. Then, she sat in a chair across the room and got busy, forgetting I existed. Nearly 5 hours later, I walked out of the oncology building feeling like I'd just gone on a weekend bender with Hunter Thompson and Satan's pharmacist. The sun had gone down and the city's more colorful citizens were starting to crawl out of their caves. I felt like I was swimming in slow motion through a crowd of grinning, talking fish, and they were all trying to sell me something. I had the vague thought that there was someone I was supposed to meet, until about 3 blocks later when I remembered that it was a lie I told that nosy woman at the front desk to get her off my back. By the time I reached the stairs leading down to the subway, my head felt like an overinflated balloon about to float up into the sky, leaving behind sad children and crying hippies concerned for the dolphins that would choke on me. The light glittered up at me from the subway like a flashlight dropped in the ocean, and I followed it down into the cold, dark ground. I didn't have to wait long for the next train, which was good because the benches were looking way too comfortable to risk sitting on them and falling asleep. When a dirty subway bench starts looking like a king-sized bed, you know you're in trouble. The A train was crowded, but luckily not packed too tight with people. Most of them were probably heading to a game or a concert or, well, whatever it is normal people did for fun. It was only by some miracle that I found an empty seat. My breath must have stunk like radioactive rat's ass because the woman in the seat next to me turned away and gave me a nice look at the back of her neck. She pretended like I wasn't there, which, to be fair, was pretty much true. I wasn't all there. Not really. My brain felt like old jelly, and my veins burned like a gasoline fire. As the automatic doors closed and the train squeaked out of the station, I could feel my head being pulled toward the floor. The invisible cowboy called Sleep had roped my neck and was swiftly taking me down, tying my hands and feet together to leave me helpless. The last thing I heard was a tinny-sounding announcement about a delay due to construction on the tracks. I distantly remembered something about a big, expensive project to dig a new tunnel and add extra subway lines, but I could barely think over the thumping of the tracks beneath us. The rhythmic sound grew slower and heavier, and my eyes did the same. They were impossibly heavy, unable to stay open. My head swirled with chemicals and the muffled sounds of voices drifting away to nothing as I fell and fell through the darkness. In my dreams, I was sitting in a cubicle, surrounded by shadows. My arms, both of them, were hooked up to tubes, long tubes that ran high above my head and into the shadows. Inside the tubes was what looked like tiny black ants, a parade of them, marching into my veins, making my arms itch and burn. So many ants. They moved like liquid, like oil sludge through an engine. I tried to pull the tubes from my arms, but they wouldn't budge, like they were soldered to my flesh. A permanent part of me. I looked up to see the bags they were attached to, where the ants were coming from, the origin of their death march. Instead of IV bags, I saw two bodies dangling above me in the dark. The tubes ran from their arms to mine, their faces just barely visible. It was Mom and Dad, smiling down at me, squeezing their arms to make the ants march faster, laughing as they fed me the blackness that lived inside of them. Before my eyes were open, I knew something was wrong. Usually falling asleep on the subway meant missing a stop. Life had continued on without you, and it was on you to shake off the sleep and catch up. But this time, it was all wrong. This time, something had changed. Not only had someone turned the volume down, they changed the channel entirely, tuned into a different frequency on another wavelength. The scattered voices of the A-train crowd had fallen silent, replaced by the strange, overbearing echo of the steel cars moving through the tunnel, tick, 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 ticking like a drawn-out time bomb. My eyelids opened like two forgotten sarcophagi, dry and scratchy as the ancient desert. I was staring down at my own shirt, my neck bent at a sharp angle. As I picked my head up, pain shot through my shoulders and neck. The muscles sore from so much time spent hunched over. I would have cursed or cried out, but my throat was even drier than my eyes, and no sound came out when I tried. Blinking, trying to focus, I looked around at the train car, attempting to make sense of what I saw. The train's overhead lights had gone out, leaving the car to be lit only by a single strip of yellow emergency lights. Much stronger were the lights coming to the windows from the subway tunnel. They strobed past, illuminating the inside of the car from front to back. A slow, steady pattern, like we were being scanned by an alien ship. But the really strange thing, the thing that made me blink the sleep from my eyes and fight the pounding in my temple, was what those lights lit up. The train car appeared to be transporting not commuters, but corpses. A few dozen dead bodies, sitting upright in their seats, rocking back and forth from the movement of the train. Light flickered slowly past them from the tunnel outside, playing across their slumped, unmoving forms. I watched the bodies sway in the strobe light, feeling the moments stretch on and on. Just me and a train car full of dead bodies, moving through the earth like a serpent in the night. It had to be a dream. It was too surreal, too bizarre to be real life. I glanced up, expecting to see my parents still strung up by tubes, but saw only the ceiling of the train car, illuminated by passing lights. On weak, sleep-heavy legs I stood, needing more than anything to know what was going on, to know what frequency I'd woken up in. I don't know if it was the cocktail of chemicals swimming in my veins or the adrenaline rush of fear, but my legs shook like a newborn deer, learning to walk. I stared at the dark train car, silently begging, praying for someone to move and break the spell. Only the rocking of the train moved the bodies, swayed them in their seats, the faint sound of their clothes shifting against the metal and plastic benches. For some reason, it hadn't occurred to me until just then that I'd been sitting next to someone when I fell asleep. The woman who pretended I didn't exist. I was starting to think she was right, that I was a ghost, drifting through the afterlife. Which was crazy, of course, but then so was what I'd woken up to. I looked back at the seat next to mine and found her exactly where I'd left her. Her head was slumped over, like the others, and she looked just as dead as them, her head swaying to the rhythmic rocking of the train. But she wasn't exactly as I'd left her. There was something different, something new about her. The neck she'd shown me when I sat down had something sticking out of it, almost like a large pyramid at the base of her skull. It was thick and short, and it came to a sharp point. Careful not to disturb her, I steadied myself against the swaying of the train and leaned in for a better look. It looked like an arrowhead erupting from the nape of her neck, complete with a dribble of dried blood at the entry point. As I got closer, I made out tiny rows of barbs. Just when I thought the woman had the oddest piercing I'd ever seen, the thing on her neck did something I really wish it hadn't done. It moved. Like the tail of a rat settling into its nest, the thing on her neck shifted and buried in deeper. My dry throat found its voice again as I nearly fell back, letting out a small guttural cry. The woman's slumped head shifted in what at first I thought was the movement of the train, taking a sharp curve in the tunnel. But then it moved again. This time rising up, the neck craning, the head turning toward the sound I'd made like a sluggish dog alerted to trouble. If I thought the barbed tail moving in her neck was shocking, it was nothing compared to the sight of the woman's eyes. Her eyelids rose like curtains at the world's worst play, revealing two white orbs. The centers were barely discolored by what used to be her corneas. In the passing lights of the subway tunnel, I saw no recognition, no reaction to the light. The woman, if she was even aware of me, couldn't see me, couldn't make out my horrified expression staring back at her, no matter how much she craned her neck and aimed her dead, milky eyes at me. Her mouth slack, and her features as barren as the surface of a cold moon. The way her head tilted reminded me of a puppet, as if not moving by choice, but by something working it from inside. With a hard realization dawning on me, I turned away from the white-eyed woman and looked at the next closest person to me. A young guy in a hoodie rocked in his seat, arms limp at his side, head slumped over. Inching closer to peek over his hood, I made out the already familiar shape on the back of his neck. A barbed tail, surrounded by dried blood. The girl next to him, wearing hoop earrings and a fake fur coat, had the same on her neck. I looked around the darkened train car, still slipping through the tunnels, lights passing in rhythm like the beat of a funeral dirge. And in that moment, alone among the bobbing, half-dead commuters of a train that didn't appear to be stopping, I finally realized the inarguable truth of what I'd woken up to. I'm dead. At the sound of my voice, little more than a whisper, the slumped head of every person in the train car shot up. I froze in place as 100 heads holding 200 white eyes scanned the dark, ears tilted, trying to locate the source of the sound. Their movements were exactly like the woman's, the moves of a puppet. Suddenly, I felt like I was going to piss my pants. I held it, though. Held my piss and held my breath as the slack-jawed crowd with the tails in their necks scanned the train car from their seats for whatever didn't belong. Whatever wasn't one of them. What they would do if they found it, if they found me, was not something I wanted to find out. At that point, I realized I had two options. The train didn't appear to be making any stops, and it was only a matter of time until the blind, infected, whatever they were, people in the train caught me standing in their midst. My first option was to sit back down in my seat and wait it out. Wait until the train stopped on its own, or someone shut it down. There was no telling how long that would take, though, and by that time I would probably piss myself and get sniffed out by the white-eyed creeps. The other option was to shut it down myself. There was no way of knowing what had happened to the train conductor, but considering we'd blown past the last few stops without signs of slowing down, it was safe to assume they either knew what was happening and wanted no part of it, or they'd been taken over as well. Either way, it meant making my way up to the conductor's car, getting inside, and somehow convincing the conductor to stop the train. Whether that meant by words or by force, I didn't know. One more glance at the woman I'd slept next to was all I needed to make up my mind. There was no way I was going to sit next to her and calmly wait for a miracle to save me, not with that unblinking, silently drooling look on her deadened face. I'd rather sit next to a crying baby on a flight from New York to Singapore. My only consolation was that I'd sat at the front of the train, and so only had to cross one car to reach the conductor. With the slowest, quietest footsteps I'd ever taken in my life, I made the excruciating trek from the back of the car to the front, holding the poles to keep me steady when I could, every inch of the way staring at the white, unblinking eyes around me, watching for the slightest hint of recognition. When I passed someone standing, their stiffened arms hooked around the poles, I moved around them at the pace of a glacier. By the time I reached the door at the front of the car, my legs were sore from staying so tense, and they'd already been tired from the personalized poison cocktail swimming through them. With the sliding door finally in front of me, I knew I'd reached a crucial moment. Do or die, if you will. After spending so much time being as silent as possible, I was about to break that silence very abruptly. There was no slow, quiet way to do it. Once the door was even slightly open, the wind from the moving train would rush in, and there was no way of knowing how the puppets were going to react to it. Not well, if I had to guess, but there was no going back. There was no other way. With my tense fingers wrapped around the cold handle, my body like a coiled spring, I wrenched the sliding door open and at the same time flung myself to the open space, the wind hitting me like a full body punch. then spun and wrenched the door shut again, holding the handle in case anyone tried to pull it open. Wind buffeted my body, my clothes flapping like a flag in a storm as the two cars bumped and swayed together. A small chain on either side was all that kept me from tumbling off the train and into the dark tunnel. Through the door's window, I watched the car I'd just escaped from come to life, like the world's worst puppet show. Passengers lurched to their crooked feet and stumbled blindly toward the door, bumping and fumbling past each other to find the noise they'd just heard. I held on tight to the handle, relieved to see none of them try to open it, not with any conviction. A few of them reached out and slapped at the door, making movements that resembled a functioning human, or maybe a dog trying to recreate something it had done accidentally. But luckily for me, it wasn't coordinated enough to actually open the heavy door. Their blind eyes stared out the window, nothing separating us but a half-inch of glass and a world of understanding. These weren't human faces in front of me. There was something alien, filtered through a layer of human bone and muscle. I'd walked among them, tempting death with each footstep. But now came the hard part. I could see him in there, through the thick, dirty glass of the final door. I watched as the train conductor sat perfectly still in his seat, his hand resting on a large button on the console. Since he was wearing a windbreaker with a collar pulled up, I couldn't get a look at his neck to see what might be hiding there, but the eeriness of his posture, the crooked way he sat in the chair with his foot on the pedal, didn't give me much hope. After about half a minute, as I gathered my courage from the wind, the button under the conductor's hand started to flash. It looked like some kind of alert, but I had no idea how trains operated, so it was only a guess. After another 30 seconds passed and he hadn't pressed the button, assumedly because he couldn't see it, it began to buzz sharply, so loud I could hear it over the wind and the clatter of the train. The moment the noise started, the conductor slapped at the button, shutting off both the noise and the light at once. Just like that, I understood what I was looking at. It was some kind of dead man's switch, designed to make sure the conductor was still both alive and awake to turn it off in the event of an emergency. Apparently, he was both alive and awake, but probably not the way the designers had planned. His mindless reaction to the stimuli was what kept the train going. It was a repeating pattern. Things make noise, hit thing until it stops making noise. Repeat. To be honest, it didn't look much different from the way I looked at work, which hit a little too close to home for me. If that thought bothered me, it was nothing compared to the realization that I was standing on a train, between moving cars no less, that was being operated by a blind man, himself operated by some kind of parasite that had dug itself into his brain. It was only a matter of time before we ran into trouble, be it a stopped train or some other blockage the conductor would have no skills to see, much less avoid. With a look around for something, anything I could use as a weapon, and coming up with a big, fat nothing, I gripped the handle of the conductor's car, took a breath, prayed silently to every god I'd ever heard of and a few I hadn't, and flung open the door. The conductor turned to face me with a slackened face and two milky white eyes that looked right through me. He was a large man, with pockmarked skin and a graying beard. He rose from the seat like his shoulders had ropes attached to them, a bad performance of Peter Pan with two uncoordinated stagehands just out of view working the pulley system. I had the bright idea that maybe he could be reasoned with, that whatever was controlling him might understand the words taken in by the ears of its host. I figured it was worth a shot, trying to reason with him, at least for the sake of my own conscience. With only a second or two to spare, I thought of the most diplomatic thing I could come up with on such short notice. "Sit down. I don't want to kill you." It certainly wasn't my best work. I paused for a moment to see how my extended olive branch would be received. To my surprise, the conductor paused as well, He cocked his head like a dog hearing the peanut butter jar and opened his mouth. Except that wasn't right. It wasn't that he opened his mouth, but rather his mouth was opened for him. I waited to hear what he had to say in return. The first words exchanged between two different species since, well, maybe ever. It might just turn out to be a historic occasion. Potential planetary war avoided by two individuals breaking down the walls of communication. Except that's not what happened. Instead of words, a noise rose up from inside his throat, like the droning song of a cicada during a hot summer. I watched in disgust as two thick antennae pushed past the conductor's tongue and lips, feeling the air around it. I thought it was part of the thing that was controlling him, conducting the conductor, so to speak, until it managed to crawl all the way out of his mouth, tail and all. It was a totally separate creature from the one in his neck. How many of those things were inside him? And more importantly, was I going to throw up on myself? It was long, nearly a foot from end to end, with a sectional body like a blackish-pink worm, and a spiked tail that wrapped around the conductor's neck. It made its way onto his shoulder with surprising speed, wet with saliva and fast as hell. The face, if you could call it that, was little more than an eyeless suction cup lined with rows of needle-like teeth that glistened as they shifted. As the creature tested the air with its twitching antennae, its long body tensed and coiled. I had already decided what thought needed to be communicated between our two species next. "You are one nasty little bastard," I said. And that's when it jumped at me. The thing sprung off the conductor's shoulder, aimed right for my face, its wormy mouth open and teeth rotating. I barely had time to move. Purely by instinct, my hand shot up in front of my face, blocking it from being hit. Instead, the creature wrapped around my wrist and squeezed tight, like a boa constrictor with a mouse in its grip. Its antennae twitched wildly, tail whipping at my arms. It struggled to reach my face. I felt its needle teeth clamp down on my exposed wrist. My nerves lit up as it bit down hard, teeth digging in. I screamed, tried to smash it against the train wall. I was desperate to get it off me, but it moved, making me slam my own injured arm into the wall. I screamed again. It pulled its suction cup mouth from my arm and hissed like a cockroach, its tiny teeth wet with my blood. I tried to shout back at it, tell it to crawl up its own ass, but it went again for my face. Served me right. Now wasn't the time for witty comebacks. I did everything I could to shake it off, smash it against something, but it was too fast, too slippery. Suddenly, I remembered the conductor was still there, and I turned to find his puppet hands reaching out toward me. He wanted to restrain me, to help the creature that had just crawled out of his mouth do its job. I raised my fist to punch him right in his creepy beard, realizing too late it was the arm that currently had a demonic worm wrapped around it. I'd screwed up, exposing my face to the slimy beast to do God knew what. But just when I thought it was over, just when I thought I was the next puppet in the world's nastiest children's show, something funny happened. The creature on my arm seized up, its long body going so tense and cut off the circulation to my hand. I felt waves of peristalsis pulse through its form. A sound almost like a wet cough came from its needled mouth, and as I watched it twist and convulse around my arm, I noticed even the conductor seemed to be listening to the sick sounds it made. The creature's skin shifted to a gray pallor. Then, its group loosened, no longer restricting my blood flow. Whatever it was doing, I didn't want to find out. I reached out, grabbed it around the middle, and squeezed as hard as I could. It squished and popped between my fingers like a rotten tomato. Once it had completely stopped squirming, I dropped it. It fell to the floor with 2 soft thumps, one for each half. I stared down at it in disbelief, ignoring the smell of my newly painted hand. I looked up at the conductor, expecting him to lash out at me, to demand revenge for whatever the hell had just happened to his tenant. But the large button, which must have been flashing while I'd fought the creature on my arm, began to buzz for attention. He cocked his head, listening blindly to the noise, then fumbled back into his seat as if I was no longer there. He slapped the button to make it stop buzzing, back at work like nothing had happened. But he was too late. The emergency brakes engaged, nearly throwing us both to the floor. With a long, dry screech of metal, the train came to a stop in the dark tunnel. I breathed a hesitant sigh of relief. We were no longer in danger of smashing into something up ahead. But being that we were sitting dead on the tracks, the risk was now that another train would smash into us. Not exactly a big difference results-wise. I stepped over the dead worm thing while keeping a close eye on the blind conductor. Without a button to press, he'd become just as useless as all his blind passengers behind us. Mounted under the console was a heavy tin box with first aid equipment inside. I used it to smash in the conductor's head, starting with the tail and the back of his neck. He didn't scream. The creature did enough of that for the 2 of them. After taking care of the conductor and his passenger, I opened the dented metal box and used one of the bandages inside to wipe the slime off my hands, the other to wrap my bleeding arm. Then, I found a heavy flashlight that worked well and felt solid in my hand. I checked in on the train passengers through the window. They returned to their seats and were once again sitting blind and half dead, as if awaiting instructions. What those instructions would be, I didn't know. I didn't want to know. There was only one thing I did know. I needed to get off that train and find my way out. Maybe warn people about what I'd seen down there. But that was a very distant second, if there was time. I climbed down between the train cars, nearly falling off in the process. My clothes got dirty with oil and grease, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was leaving the train of the damned behind and getting above ground. At that point, I noticed something interesting. The big bite wound in my arm wasn't bothering me at all. I studied the bandage under the beam of the flashlight and found the blood had already stopped flowing. Even though the skin around it was red and inflamed, it didn't hurt at all. In fact, it was almost numb to the touch. It made me think of mosquitoes and how their saliva works like an anesthetic so we don't feel them working on us. From what I recalled, they even inject us with anticoagulants to keep the blood flowing. Could these things do something similar? Numb us up, but heal the entry wound instead to preserve the host? I didn't want to think about that either. Not until I got the hell out of hell. With the flashlight in hand, I looked both ways down the tunnel, where we'd come from and where we were going. They both looked equally unpromising. I decided to move forward, telling myself it was a sign of optimism or some bullshit. The truth was, I didn't want to walk along the train and past all those windows to catch even one glimpse of all the lifeless puppets in there. Just the thought of it sent a chill up my tired back. The tunnel lights were a lot further apart than I remembered. Where before they'd passed by in a steady, hypnotic pattern to light up the train car of seemingly dead bodies, on foot, they were a few minutes apart, meaning I spent more time in the dark than I did the light. The flashlight helped, though even combined, the lights weren't enough to beat back the shadows of that cold, dead place. Dirt and small rocks crunched under my dragging feet, echoing off the walls. It felt like an eternity down there in the dark. Emptiness behind, infinity ahead. But the real problem was, I wasn't alone in those tunnels. Living in the city, you get used to the sounds of rodents and insects, the scratching of rats, the pitter-patter of roaches searching for food. You don't like it, of course, but You kind of accept the inevitability of dirty things in your life. They could be kept at bay for a little while, killed and contained and kept away from your food, but eventually, they always find their way back in. Except what I was hearing wasn't rats, and it wasn't roaches either. All around me, coming from the shadows and off the walls, was the shuffle of rocks and dirt. Invisible things, sliding through the darkness, crawling and slipping along the ground and over the train tracks. I knew exactly what they were looking for, and I considered turning off the flashlight to make sure they didn't find it. Then, I remembered it didn't matter anyway. They were blind as bats. More so, since they were actually blind, it probably didn't matter if I kept the flashlight on, just that I not make any noise. I decided to keep it on so I could see better and not trip in the dark, thus making noise and attracting attention. Still, I didn't aim it directly down at the ground. There was no point in pushing it, and I really didn't want to see the ground moving around my feet. After what must have been 8 or 9 years, or 20 minutes, depending on how you do the math, I found a door. It was unlocked, thankfully, and it led to a maintenance area that looked like it hadn't been used in over a decade. It was a large room, carpeted in dust and rat droppings, without a single light bulb to light it up. I didn't know what a damned thing in it was used for, other than a few broken-down generators and an old mop, but I wasn't planning on sticking around to find out. I hurried through the stale-smelling place, through another door, and up a stairwell thick with cobwebs and cigarette butts, tripping over my own feet the entire way. After a few turns and another door, I found myself ejected unceremoniously into a subway station I'd never been in before. It really didn't matter, so long as it got me that much closer to ground level. Though, as I weaved my way across the platform and up another flight of stairs, I noticed that the station was completely empty. Not even a ticket booth was occupied. The sight was troubling, but at that moment, I cared only about getting to the surface, about reaching the air and the light, and God help me, even the people. My legs were tired and my heart pounded and my lungs felt like they would burst, but I charged up those final steps faster than I'd ever run before, like an overdue baby, ready to be born. Finally, I was free, above ground and out of the grave. The night air felt cool and refreshing on my hot, sweaty skin, and even the city's smoggy air was an improvement on what I'd been breathing. I gave myself a few seconds to enjoy the victory and take in the feeling. I'd made it. I'd looked death in its eyeless, suction-cupped face and lived to talk about it. When the novelty of being alive wore off, which took all of 10 seconds, I spotted a police officer standing near an intersection. The traffic was at a standstill, and my guess was she was there to direct it. Seeing a real live authority figure, the responsibility of warning someone about what I'd seen hit me like it hadn't before. People needed to know what was going on, to stop it from spreading. And if I was going to be the selfless hero to do it, recognized for the rest of my life as the man who saved them all, then all the better. "Officer!" I shouted as I ran up to her. "Down there! The subway! They need help! Creatures! Horrible things!" My words were a mess, coming out a few at a time and mostly out of order. But as she turned to face me, to look not at me, but through me, with those clouded over eyes and that blank expression, I knew my words didn't matter. None of it mattered, because no one cared. Not the officer in front of me, not the people standing blindly around us. Not even the drivers in all the cars stopped all along the street, as far as I could see. The city was eerily quiet, yet still full of people. But to call them people was an exaggeration. They were puppets. A city of puppets standing around waiting for their strings to be pulled. The only sounds I heard were the idling of car engines and the useless changing of traffic signals. That, and the crawling, the shuffling and slithering of legless things in the alleys and under the ground. I backed away from the police officer before she could open her mouth and birth the inevitable. When I found a somewhat secluded place in a small park, away from all the wide-eyed, slack-faced puppets, I sat down on a bench and buried my face in my hands. Was I the only one not taken by those things? And if so, should I feel lucky about it? Or somehow offended? Was I actually beneath the standards of blind, brain-sucking worms? As I sat at the bench contemplating what to do next, where to go or who to call, I rubbed my aching neck. Between the chemo cocktail and my adventure down below, which included the cardio-heavy act of beating a man to death, I was tired to my bones. My fingers touched something on my neck. I jumped up from the bench, panic coursing through me, and slapped and clawed at the back of my head to pull whatever it was loose. I would die before I let one of those things turn me into a puppet. No way was I letting them win. Not after all I'd gone through. But nothing came. There was no tail, no creature. I looked at my hand and found it stained with dried blood. Touching my neck again, carefully, I felt a large wound there, all caked with scabs and coagulated blood, and only a faint stinging to go with it. More from my clumsy slapping and clawing than anything. It didn't make sense. But then I thought of the anesthetic in the mosquito saliva, the coagulant, and I thought of what happened to the conductor's car when the creature bit my arm. It was almost like an allergic reaction I'd witnessed, a violent response to something foreign and dangerous. A reaction to my blood, to the chemical cocktail floating in my veins. The chemo had turned my blood toxic, not just a bad taste but a dangerous one. Those 4 hours under the needle had been like being fitted for armor, a radioactive shield, protecting me from the tiny, vile dragons of the world, the enemy of my enemy. As I stood there, trying to understand how dying had saved my life, how the monster inside me had protected me from the ones outside, I became aware of footsteps on the sidewalk nearby. They were normal footsteps, not the shuffling of puppet feet, and as I stood silently in the small park, I watched a hooded figure walk past. She was fairly tall, a young woman in a purple hoodie, and when she turned to casually glance at me without stopping, I saw beneath her hood. She had no hair, only eyebrows, and a hard stare that said she'd been to hell and back. She was gorgeous in a princess warrior kind of way. With those gray eyes, she'd stared down the same death as me, taken the same poisons, killing herself to live. After we locked eyes for one intense moment, she simply nodded, then kept walking until she disappeared around a corner. 2 ships, passing in the night. I took a deep breath, filling up my diseased lungs with night air, inflating those twin monsters inside me, monsters locked away in a rib cage. Then I found a phone and dialed a number I hadn't dialed in years, watching the puppets walk blindly past. Fake lives, with fake meaning. My father picked up, though it was on speakerphone as usual. My mother was in the room too. They both started talking at once, asking about the things they were hearing about on the news. I cut them off, stopping them from talking over each other, and told them to listen to me very carefully. Oh, there's good news, and there's bad news, I explained to them. The good news is, I have cancer. The bad news is, you don't. I hung up before they could say another word. Then, I went off to find the Princess Warrior. It was time to start a new tribe. A poisonous tribe. One free of strings.
Dakota lifted his gaze from the burning embers of the campfire toward the sky. Tonight, the stars were brilliant in a cloudless sky. Tree limbs, heavy with unfallen leaves, barely moved. This natural stillness normally produced a calm within him, a calmness his people expected of their medicine man. His leadership over the past 4 decades had kept his tribe fed and safe, a fate other groups did not achieve. But his intuition told him all was about to change. Tonight, dread filled his soul. He sensed the coming of an event so horrific it would tear his world apart. Stories told around a campfire by the Ancient Ones so long ago forewarned of a night like this, a night where the silence would be broken by a scream of light. As he watched the thick ribbon of stars flowing from southwest to northeast, a bright light caught his attention. Barely distinguishable among the others, its movement caused him to study it more carefully. The speed of the light crossing the sky increased, as did the intensity of the glow. When it passed overhead, he felt and heard the scream foretold by the Ancient Ones. The light disappeared behind a ridge, and the roar of a windstorm could be heard for only a few moments. Then, silence. His world returned to quiet as if nothing strange had occurred. The ribbon of stars provided enough light for him to distinguish landmarks, telling him where the odd light had fallen to the ground. Covering his campfire with dirt until the glowing embers faded, he set out, determined to discover if his fears concerning this event were justified. His search took most of the night. When he topped a ridge half a day's walk southeast of his village, he saw an object below in a valley, an object he had never observed before, but one described to him long ago by the Ancient Ones. It resembled the egg of a bird, only thousands of times larger. 4 legs extended from the body of the egg to the ground, supporting its weight. The outside of the structure reflected the dim glow of the stars. Strange markings were evident on the sides. From his vantage point above the valley, he stood like a statue. How long he remained unmoving, he did not know. The eastern sky glowed with the coming of dawn, and yet he continued to direct his gaze on the strange object. Hours passed. The sun rose in the morning sky. Still, Dakota remained. With the sun directly overhead, the object vibrated and a hole appeared underneath. Dakota stepped behind a large tree to obscure his presence from whatever might emerge from the egg. To his surprise, a box with 4 tubes attached to the corners began to be lowered to the ground. His curiosity satisfied, he turned and began the long trek back to his village. He would need to explain the dangers that lay ahead. The Ancient One's predictions, heard so long ago, would finally come to pass. Flight Commander Logan O'Neill read the planet survey summary for the 4th time. The original examination of this particular planet, accomplished by an unmanned probe 100 years prior, identified it as an uninhabited M-class planet. Mineral composition contained oxygen, silicon, aluminum, iron, and calcium in almost the same percentage as O'Neill's home planet, plus an abundance of free-flowing water and flora. Mission Specialist Carol Snow looked over O'Neill's shoulder. "You've been studying this plant's profile for almost 4 hours, Logan. What's so interesting?" "I'm finding the analysis hard to comprehend. A planet of this age, with all of these resources, should have produced multicellular reptilian or mammalian life by now. I realize I'm supposed to know this, but remind me again the age of this rock?" O'Neill smiled. "This planet's star is relatively young for this section of the galaxy. It's 4 billion years younger than Sol, so maybe it hasn't had time for the proper evolution to kick in. From what I've seen, it is beautiful. Too bad we're here to screw it up?" "Not necessarily. The Foundation has learned from some of its earlier mistakes. We are not here to terraform the place, just identify its worthiness for colonization." Snow kissed his forehead. "Oh, how naive that sounds, Logan. The Foundation will colonize, conquer, and ravage this little piece of heaven in the galaxy, just like it has on other planets over the generations." "Then why are you on this mission if you feel so cynical?" "I'm an explorer, Logan. I love discovering new things, and more importantly, I love you." She patted him on the shoulder. "Besides, I find your innocent naivete charming. You're the last optimist in the galaxy." She chuckled and left the command center. He watched her leave and said under his breath, "It's not that I'm naive. I just choose to be positive about our explorations." Returning his gaze to the computer monitor, he continued to go over the previous survey of the planet. Flight engineer Nina Webb cleared her throat as she stood in the entrance to Logan O'Neill's stateroom. He looked up from his computer. "Ah, Nina, come in." "You asked to see me, Skipper?" "Yes. When is the next launch window for our rendezvous with the Hermes?" "In ship time?" "Yes." 840 standard ship hours." Nina paused and gave him a whimsical smile. "That's 35 standard days. Our mothership is, as you know, dispatching another team to one other M-class planet in this system." He nodded. "Any contingencies in case of emergencies?" "Not following you." "While I don't anticipate any trouble, but how fast can we take off if needed?" "Safely 3 hours, in an emergency 10 minutes. You expecting trouble?" Taking a deep breath, Logan shook his head. "Not at the moment, but I've seen several inconsistencies within the previous survey of this planet and our own observations." She leaned against the doorframe to his cabin and crossed her arms. "Care to share with your flight engineer?" "I think I have to. The original survey indicated the only non-plant life discovered on this planet were unicellular algae-type creatures." "I'm familiar with them." "Jack did a preliminary survey around the landing site and discovered what he called ant-like creatures." "That's a far cry from algae." "I know. It took almost 600 million years for single-cell organisms to evolve into multicellular insects on our home planet." "Maybe the first survey missed them." "An assumption I suspect is correct." "So how would that cause us trouble, Skipper?" "I'm just wondering what other organisms it missed." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you think it's possible?" "I've never heard of it happening before, but there is always a first time." "You want me to pre-stage the ship for an emergency takeoff?" O'Neill shook his head. "I don't want my wariness to rub off on the crew. Just be mindful of a possible need." She stopped, leaning. "I can do that. In the meantime, we need you to sign off on our first extravehicular excursion." O'Neill watched on the command center monitor as mission specialists Carol Snow and Jack Brady lifted the PVTOL, or PVTOL, planetary vertical takeoff or landing aircraft, away from the ship. Their destination, the top of a ridge roughly 3 kilometers to the west of their landing location. Nina Webb stood next to him. "How long for them to get there?" Jack guessed a half an hour. He wants to take it slow and observe the flora between here and the top. Battery power will give them 2 hours of flight time if he uses all 4 propellers. She nodded as she watched the drone-shaped vehicle climb to an altitude above the surrounding trees. It disappeared 2 minutes later. Using the radio, O'Neill said, "Jack, maintain voice contact as you climb." "Roger, nothing to report this early in the flight." "Don't care, sing a song if you want." They heard a chuckle from the speaker. "Trust me, you'll regret asking," the disembodied voice continued. "From what we can see, the trees thin out the higher we go. Do we know our elevation above sea level where the ship landed?" Nina said, 1,000 meters. "Got it. Lift is steady, maintaining current power usage." "Good. Wait a minute, Skipper. We're coming up on a USO." "What do you mean, an unidentified stationary object?" "I can tell you it didn't occur naturally." "Then what the hell is it?" "I'll be damned." "Jack." Dakota handed the pipe to the man on his left. Denali, a tall and handsome warrior, accepted the object and inhaled deeply. He then passed it to his left and exhaled. The smoke dissipated as it rose with the heat of the fire. "The spirit warrior has spoken to me, O great medicine man." "What has he told you, Denali?" "We are to face great obstacles. The appearance of the giant egg is an omen." "Yes." He watched the pipe pass from one warrior to the next. He continued, "How do we cast out the giant egg, Denali?" "We must do what our ancestors did, beseech the sun and stars to strike out at our invaders." With a knowing nod, Dakota asked, "What do the rest of you warriors suggest?" A murmur arose, and the shaman sitting directly across from Dakota raised his head, his image flickering in the light of the fire. "The Ancient Ones foretold of this day, my brothers. They tell us of a previous visit by these flying eggs. 100 winters ago, one visited our world, and our ancestors isolated it until it rose again into the sky and disappeared." Denali spoke in his baritone voice. "We must destroy this one. We cannot allow it to return again." The shaman closed his eyes and started chanting. Dakota listened and then spoke above the rising tempo of the warriors joining the song. "Brothers." No one responded. He tried again, this time louder. "Brothers." The interior of the teepee grew quiet. "Brothers, Denali is correct. The last time one visited our world, it was allowed to go free. Now another has arrived. The Ancient Ones were right to warn us of this day. We must not betray the trust they have bestowed upon us." The warriors joined together in a chant as Dakota stood. He allowed them to continue for several minutes. Finally, he raised his hands. Silence ensued. "Prepare yourselves for a possible long journey. I will travel to the home of the Ancient Ones and seek their guidance. When I return, we will know what to do about the egg from the sky." "Skipper, it looks like the skeleton of an ancient teepee. The upright posts are tied together at the top and only tattered cloth remains attached to the poles." O'Neill closed his eyes and exhaled. "Landon confirmed, Jack." "Roger that." Nina placed a hand on his arm. "Skipper, this can't be." He shot a quick glance at her. "Why not? We've been lied to before. What makes this situation any different?" "This planet is not supposed to be inhabited." "So we were told." Neither Nina or O'Neill spoke as they listened to Brady land the PV-TOL. They heard both Carol and him securing the aircraft from flight mode. Brady said, "Carol, stay with the PV-TOL. Leave the rotors on idle and I'll check this out." "Roger." Silence ensued on the speaker for several minutes. The next song came from a winded and excited Jack Brady. "Skipper, this damn planet has intelligent life on it." "Take a breath, Jack, and then explain." "Inside the teepee poles was a charred area, surrounded by a circle of rocks. Animal remains were also nearby. I would swear they belonged to a rabbit and several birds." O'Neill took this information and stared out the command center viewport. Finally, he said, "Collect samples of the remains and return to the ship." "Roger." Paul Weaver, the ship's pilot and communication engineer, crawled up the ladder into the command modular. "Hey, Skipper, we're getting a distress call from the Hermes." O'Neill fixed his attention on the man, put it on speaker. The pilot went to a communications console and flipped a switch. A disembodied voice said, "Repeat, Hermes 1, this is Hermes. We are declaring an emergency. Do you copy?" O'Neill slipped on a headset with a built-in microphone. "Hermes, this is O'Neill. State your emergency." "Logan, this is Barbara. We just launched Hermes 2 for its descent to TRAPPIST-1D when we got hit by a massive solar EMP. The pulse knocked out 90% of our ship's computers, and we are on manual control. Only communication and life support systems are online." "What about Hermes 2? "They are not responding to our requests for updates." "Barbara, can you reboot the computer systems?" "No one is sure right now. I'm being told some of the circuits are fried and need to be replaced." "Do you have enough replacement parts?" "My chief engineer is too busy to ask at the moment." "What about propulsion control?" "That's what they're working on. Our orbit was low so we could launch Hermes 2. We're getting ready to..." She paused. "Just a second, Logan." The three individuals in the Hermes 1 command center remained quiet. O'Neill thought he could hear his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at Paul, snapped his fingers, and whispered, "Get on the sensors and see what you can detect." With a nod, the pilot moved to another console and started making adjustments. O'Neill turned to Nina. "Check to see if the EMP affected any of our systems." "TRAPPIST-1D isn't aligned with 1E right now. Sunspots are regional and electromagnetic pulses, when emitted, are normally a focused beam of high energy. We should be okay, but I'll check." "Do it." The voice of the Hermes commander came back on the speaker. "Oh my God, Logan. The Hermes 2 entered the atmosphere, broke apart, and the pieces are burning up in the atmosphere." O'Neill closed his eyes and shook his head. "What about your situation? Any updates?" "Not looking good for us either." Her voice remained calm and professional. "We can't stop our orbital degradation. I'm told if we don't get our propulsion back online here in the next few minutes, we're doomed." "Not sure what to say, Barbara." "Nothing to say, look." The hiss from the speakers told O'Neill all he needed to know. Hermes had entered the planet's atmosphere and was probably breaking up. He looked at his pilot, who turned and just shook his head. "Damn." Paul said, "Skipper, in the data we received, TRAPPIST-1 was classified as a stable G-type star, similar to Sol. However, readings we are getting show it's actually an M-class. It's several billion years older than Sol and entering a phase of instability." "Wait a minute, Paul. That data indicated it was younger than Earth's sun." "Not according to what these instrument readings are telling me." The flight commander drummed his fingers on a control panel. "What the hell else is incorrect about our information on this system?" Nina looked up. "Whatever it might be, it just cost the lives of every crew member of the Hermes, Hermes 2, and probably us as well. We've got no way to get home." Dakota entered the cavern only he, as the medicine man, knew about. His predecessor and mentor introduced him to this sacred place over 40 winters ago. Since then, his need to travel to this location rarely occurred. Tonight, he felt a compelling need to consult with the Ancient Ones. Communicating with them required a simple but intricate process. Stripped down to his loincloth, he sat cross-legged in the center of the sanctuary's smooth floor. Before him stood a clear tube half the height of a grown male. He sat with his hands on his knees with his palms facing the ceiling. Closing his eyes, he recited the words his mentor told him to memorize so many years ago. The words held no meaning for him, but his instructions were to pronounce them properly and in the correct order. Alpha 5-2, Beta 9-7, Phi 12, Delta 72, Lambda 17. A glow appeared at the bottom of the tube, intensified and extended to the top as he recited the words. When he finished, a baritone voice said, "Who has spoken the code?" "It is I, Dakota, medicine man of the Nuevo Nation of Humans." "You are recognized, Dakota. Speak." "A large egg-shaped vessel has landed on our world. I grow concerned about the appearance of this object and seek guidance on how to protect my people." "Dakota, medicine man of the Nuevo Nation of Humans, think back on the teachings of your ancestors. Did they not predict this would happen?" "Yes." Are there men like yourself inside the vessel? I do not know. I have not seen any. When you see who occupies it, you will know what to do. How? Think back on your lessons from your ancestors. They told you about this day. Remember their words. But the glow diminished and Dakota knew the interview was over. He sat in the dark as the final words spoken to him suddenly made sense. The mood among the crew of the Hermes 1 could only be described as dire. All were professional astronauts with thousands of hours of experience. Each knew the dangers of venturing outside their home solar systems and all accepted the risk. However, the reality of the current situation made them face the cold, sobering fact they were now stranded 40 light-years from their home planet. Carol Snow stood behind O'Neill as he studied the readouts of the demise of the Hermes mothership. Logan, let's face it, we're stuck here. I know, Carol. Without the Hermes, we cannot communicate with the Foundation in a timely manner. With the equipment we have on board, any message we send will take 40 years to reach them. A lot can happen in 40 years. Yes, I'm aware of that. Paul Weaver climbed up through the access tube into the command center. Hey, Skipper, Jack and I have jury-rigged warning pods we can place around Hermes 1. They'd give us a heads up if something alive approached the ship. Plus, who or what will get a surprise when they try to cross the boundaries? O'Neill nodded. Thanks, Paul. How much time will they give us? Depends on how far from the ship you want to place them. What's their range? In theory, a kilometer. In reality, I wouldn't put them more than half a click from the ship. Make it so. Before you go, Paul, do we have the fuel to take off and land again? Couple of times. Why? In case we need to move our location. We'll need to be careful with our fuel use. What if the next place is worse? Good point. Okay, you and Jack go ahead and set up the early warning pods, but neither of you are to do anything solo. Always have a buddy with you on extravehicular activities. Got it, Skipper. When the pilot disappeared down the access tube, Carol turned to O'Neill. What are you not telling us about this planet, Logan? He hesitated for a few moments. The information in our database about this place isn't even close to what we've observed. Before we broke Earth orbit, I was assured the survey information about this planet would be 100% accurate. Now it appears there's probably intelligent life here. I think it's more than probable. I agree, but how do we prove it? Send up the high-altitude unmanned drones. If the place is inhabited, they should be able to tell us. That's a good idea, Carol. Can you work with Paul to get them in the air? She nodded. Then what? We slip into survival mode. If the place is inhabited, we need to determine if it is hostile to our presence. If we find they are, we need to find somewhere we can defend, settle in, and survive. 4 drones lifted off from a patch of ground north of Hermes 1. All were programmed to seek out nutrient-enriched soil and flowing water. Plus, they were equipped with ground-searching radar and ultra-red imaging to search for living organisms. Paul Weaver controlled the flights remotely from his console on the level below the command center. Each of the drones had a range of 100 kilometers and would spread out within their quadrant in a triangular flight pattern. The programmed path would return the drones to the Hermes 1 when their missions were completed. O'Neill asked, Do I need to help you monitor them, Paul? Weaver smiled and looked up at his commanding officer. Skipper, don't worry. I know what I'm doing. With a limp smile, O'Neill placed his hand on the pilot's shoulder. I know, Paul. I'm just anxious about the results. Me too. If there's anything to find, they'll find it. What if we need to move to another continent? Do we have the fuel? We would have to gain orbit and then land. We've only got the fuel to do that once. Then let's find a compatible spot close to here. How many jumps could we do? Max of 3. Beyond that, I can't promise a smooth landing. Got it. O'Neill retreated to his stateroom 2 floors below. When he got there, the room was empty. After taking his uniform off, he lay on his bunk with his hands behind his head. 15 minutes later, Carol Snow entered the room and locked the door. She wore a simple smock, which she pulled off over her head. O'Neill watched her and lifted the covers as she slipped in next to him. She snuggled and asked, "Are we going to be okay, Logan?" Silence filled the room as the commanding officer drew her into an embrace. The optimist in me says yes. The realist isn't sure yet. She buried her face against his chest, his arms encircling her. She said, "I want the optimist to be correct." "So do I." The 6 crew members gathered in the galley the next morning to listen to Renee Weaver, the mission's biologist and medical doctor, summarize the drone missions from the previous evening. "If we stay where we are now, we're basically screwed." O'Neill sipped coffee. "Why?" "The soil within 200 kilometers of our position has a high alkaline pH. So high, only certain trees, shrubs, and vines can survive. The drones found no edible vegetation within a 100-kilometer radius circle. Limestone is prominent underneath the subsoil. While we have evidence animals were here at one time, they seem to have disappeared. I don't even recommend consuming the water." O'Neill raised an eyebrow. "Surely our osmosis system will clean it?" "Preliminary analysis shows unknown single-cell organisms in abundant quantities. The process will get most of them, but it's the ones we don't get that worry me." "What about boiling the water?" "We can try, but some of the bacteria appear to be heat-resistant." "How about ultraviolet radiation?" "We're still testing and it shows promise." O'Neill did not respond as he drummed his fingers on the galley table. "So the environment where we are currently is hostile to human existence?" Renee nodded. "For our biological makeup, that's a correct assessment." Jack Brady stood to refill his coffee. "That fact wasn't mentioned in the initial survey, was it, Skipper?" "No, it wasn't. The only fact the survey was correct on was the atmosphere. Same basic composition as Earth. 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 0.9% argon, and 0.1% other gases such as carbon dioxide." The mission specialist sipped his freshly poured coffee. "So we need to find somewhere else on this rock to try to survive?" Nina Webb said, "Unless we abandon this planet and try another one within the system." Shaking his head, O'Neill clasped his hands and placed them on the table. "I don't trust any of the data from the original survey of this solar system. This planet was considered the best one suitable for colonization. You have to remember, we have 3 planets in our sun's habitable zone. One is Venus, which has a runaway greenhouse effect, and the other is the dust bowl of Mars. No, we have to stay on this planet. We have enough fuel to do 3 hops and that's it. I believe we need to be cautious and not waste any of our fuel until we figure out a good landing spot." Carol spoke for the first time during the meeting. "I've been running some numbers. We have enough food on board to last 6 months. If we ration, maybe 9. We don't know what the seasons are like here. Plus, we haven't seen any living multi-cell animals larger than ants so far. The skeletal remains from the teepee were very old." She paused. "I haven't seen any birds either. We need to send the drones out again to search for other life. Let's face the facts, we're going to be here a while. If we are going to survive, we need to find a place where we can start growing our own crops." Nina nodded. "I'm with Carol. The planet is tilted on its axis more severely than Earth, so seasons could be a lot more diverse and severe. Since we are on the equator, somewhere else around here might be our best bet." A vibration could be felt throughout the ship, which grew in intensity with each passing second. O'Neill muttered, "Oh, what fresh hell is this?" All 6 members of the crew, without being told, hurried to their duty station. O'Neill climbed the ladder toward the command center. Dakota stood to leave the Ancient One's cavern when the ground began to shake. He rushed toward the entrance, trying to keep his balance at the same time counting. Most of the tremors lasted to a count of 60 or 90. Dust and pebbles fell from the cave's ceiling as he grew closer to the opening. His count went to over 100 as he passed through the entrance. After hearing the sound of large rocks crashing to the floor behind, he turned to see a large boulder partially block the entrance. When his counting reached 150, the tremors stopped. Dust continued to fall from the ceiling as he looked in. A low rumble from deep within the cavern caused Dakota to stand back from the entry as a cloud of dust and debris billowed out. When quiet returned to the cave, he re-entered to retrace his steps toward the home of the Ancient Ones. When he arrived, the clear tube lay shattered on the floor. Plus, one of the room's walls had collapsed, exposing sunlight and a huge open-air expanse. He stepped into the newly revealed area and marveled at what it contained. The sight of the object suddenly brought back all the words his ancestors had told him long ago. "Bad news, Skipper." Jack Brady popped his head up through the opening into the command center without entering. O'Neill turned to look at the mission specialist, who also acted as the team's geologist. "How bad?" "The scale of that quake was off the charts compared to anything we've ever measured on Earth. From what we could determine, the epicenter was thousands of miles north. So in other words, this hellhole is also unstable. Ground radar shows the crust of the planet underneath us as porous, like a sponge. So these types of earthquakes could be common and happen on a regular basis. Aren't we lucky? Paul and I think it's imperative we find a more stable locale. There's a strong possibility a sinkhole could open under us at any moment." "That bad?" Brady nodded. "Yeah, that bad." "Okay, let's get out of here. Have Nina prepare to take off." "Roger that, Skipper." O'Neill folded his arms as Nina Webb sat at the flight control modular on the command deck. He asked, "Can we obtain orbit?" "Yes, but we would only have enough fuel to land and that would be it. Where we set down will be our home for at least 40 years, probably longer." "My guess would be longer." "Mine too." She looked up at him. "Jack is concerned about the data we have on this planet." "I don't trust it either." "What happens if this is the most stable region on the planet?" "The thought has crossed my mind." "Like we've discussed, we have enough fuel to do 3 medium-length hops or make orbit once." "I know. When we first got here, I argued with the mission commander about letting us orbit for a day or so to get a feel for the place. She told me to trust the surveys and do my job." "Guess you won't get a chance to tell her she was wrong." "No." He scratched the stubble of his week-old beard. "Keep preparing the ship for takeoff. I'm calling a meeting with the others." 15 minutes later, the remaining 5 members of Hermes 1's crew gathered in the galley. O'Neill started the meeting. "I've had a short conversation with Nina. She says we have enough fuel to make orbit and then land again, hopefully in a more stable environment. The original survey of this planet indicated where we are today is the best suited to start colonization." He looked at all 5 individuals. "As we have discovered, the survey was total BS." Nods from the others. "Okay, we have a decision to make. Make orbit and take our time surveying the planet and pick a new spot. Once we do, that's it. We have to make it our home for the foreseeable future." Carol asked, "Or?" "We make up to 3 medium-length hops to various spots and see if they are more stable." Renee Weaver raised her hand. "How far is a medium hop?" "Good question. Nina told me less than 1,000 kilometers." "What if we make shorter hops? Can we make more?" Shaking his head, O'Neill said, "Doesn't work that way. Most of the fuel is used on takeoff and landing. We have enough for 3 and only 3. Renee and Paul looked at each other. He nodded, and she said, "Paul and I vote to make orbit." O'Neill looked at Jack. "What do you Nina say?" "Orbit." Carol put her arm around O'Neill's waist. "What do you think?" "It's up to you." "Orbit." "Then it's unanimous. We make orbit and see what's going on with this rock." The egg-shaped vessel emitted fire as it rose toward the heavens. Dakota felt a sense of satisfaction. His plan to force the object to leave would remain that, only a plan. Since it included the possible deaths of whoever traveled within the egg, he felt a sense of relief. He did not want to instruct the warriors of his tribe to take a life. Killing was never a good answer, but in self-defense of his people, he would not hesitate to make the decision. He watched it until the object disappeared into a cloudless sky. The rainy season would start soon, and it was time for everyone in his tribe to start planting. The shimmering radiances, known to him as devil lights, lit the sky as the sun set low on the western horizon. The increasing frequency of their appearance concerned him, along with the growing intensity of the earthquakes and the scarcity of game for his warriors to hunt. Maybe it was time to move his tribe, although where to remained a mystery. Hermes 1 circled the planet TRAPPIST-1e in a polar orbit for a week. While the ship circled the globe every 90 minutes, its rotation underneath them exposed a new part of the surface each time around. This allowed the crew to search the entirety of the planet for a suitable landing zone. At the end of the week, having measured and surveyed the entire planet numerous times, a dejected crew gathered in the galley for yet another briefing. "Well, now we know," Jack Brady summarized the findings. "There is a narrow strip of arable land extending 150 kilometers above and the same distance below the equator. Since most of this planet's surface in this narrow region is ocean, where we originally landed seems to be the most hospitable section of the planet." O'Neill stood off to the side of the meeting, his arms folded with one hand supporting his chin. He let the crew talk. Renee Weaver spoke next. "Paul and I have been able to determine this planet, like Earth, possesses an iron core and thus a magnetosphere. Unlike Earth, it is less dense and only protects this narrow strip around the planet from solar radiation emitted by TRAPPIST-1. The loss of the Hermes and our sister ship Hermes 2 was due to an outbreak of sunspots which are causing numerous EMP bursts. We believe this particular star is entering a new stage of solar instability, and at some point in the near future, the radiation emitted by the star could overcome the weak magnetic field generated by the planet's less dense iron core. When that happens, whatever life is left will be wiped out." O'Neill spoke for the first time. "So even if we find a place where we can grow crops and build shelter, it will all be for naught?" "Unfortunately, Skipper, that is correct." "How long?" Paul answered. "Year, 2, maybe never. As we know, the data from the early exploration of this planetary system was completely wrong. We don't know the planet's history. The current situation may have been the norm for centuries. We just don't know." The commander pressed his lips together. "Is this the only habitable planet in the system?" He looked at Nina Webb. "No, TRAPPIST-1d is similar, but we don't have the fuel available to break orbit, circle it, and safely re-enter the atmosphere." "Puts us in a no-win situation, doesn't it?" Everyone nodded. "Well then, let's go around a few more times and identify a better spot for us to target as a landing zone." The point of light grew brighter by the moment as it streaked across the sky. Denali, chief warrior of the Nuevo Nation, followed its trek. His band of men stood behind him. Some watched in awe, others feared it as a bad omen. When the light vanished behind a mountain east of where they hunted, he stood silently memorizing the location. Speaking to no one in particular, he said, "The egg-shaped object has returned." The shimmering and swirling lights, having grown more intense during the egg-shaped vessel's absence, momentarily dimmed as the object streaked overhead in the sky. "I must return to the village and tell Dakota what I have witnessed." Turning to his band of men, he made a whooping sound and set off toward their village at a steady pace. His warriors followed. Denali sat on the ground in Dakota's teepee. A fire burned in the center with the smoke climbing toward the opening at the top. The older man asked, "You bring word of the egg-shaped object?" "Yes, it has returned." "Where?" "Over the eastern mountains." "Can you lead a group of warriors to it?" "Yes." Remaining quiet for a few moments, he noticed Denali did not prepare to leave. Instead, he displayed a frown on his handsome face. Dakota continued, "You have concerns, my brother?" Denali nodded. "Speak." "When the object flew overhead, the shimmering lights faded and then stopped. Once the light disappeared behind the mountain, only then did the swirling colors return to the sky." Dakota's brow furrowed. "And you saw this with your own eyes?" "Yes. Ask my warriors. Many called it a bad omen." "The shimmering lights are growing in both brightness and intensity. Our ancestors do not foretell of this happening." Is the appearance of the egg causing the shimmering lights, Dakota? Only the ancient ones can answer that question, Denali. Unfortunately, they have been silenced by the shaking earth. What do you ask of me? Follow me with your warriors. We will find the egg-shaped vessel. And when we do, the very existence of our people depends on our success. It must be destroyed. As you wish. The warrior bowed. When do we leave? During the final moments of the Hermes 1 descent, one of the 5 thruster engines on the vehicle failed. This caused the ship to tilt and land harder than engineering specs designed it to do. The landing leg on the port side of the vehicle collapsed and caused the ship to topple onto its side. Computerized controls saved the crew from a catastrophic event by immediately taking control. However, the ship would, at some point, need to be abandoned for safety reasons. 5 of the crew survived the landing without a scratch. Unfortunately, Renee Weaver suffered a broken leg and was immobilized. She supervised the setting of her leg and the inflation of a temporary cast, which would have to be utilized until she healed. Solar panels were deployed to power the generator used to inflate the team's extravehicular inflatable habitat. With the crew's biologist supported by crutches and all stores and equipment secured, O'Neill surveyed the landing zone. Carol Snow stood next to him. He said, "Well, it could have been worse." She chuckled. "I don't see how." Think about it for a second. We could have missed the landing zone and been on top of the mountain over there. When the ship toppled, we'd still be rolling down the side. Taking a deep breath, she hugged his arm. "I see what you mean. Lucky us." Yes, in 40 years, when our SOS sent from orbit is finally received on Earth, they will assume we are all dead. I am sure cost-cutting measures will be enacted and a rescue mission won't even be discussed. So, this is it? Yeah, this is it. Jack Brady cleared his throat. Sorry to intrude on you two, but we have another problem. Rolling his eyes, O'Neill took a breath. You're just full of good news lately, Jack. Sorry, Skipper, but I found something about a half click from here you need to see. O'Neill noticed a sidearm on the mission specialist's hip. Why the gun? I found human tracks. Bending over, O'Neill examined the imprint in the soil. Damn, it sure looks like a human foot. There are more prints 10 meters to the east. How many? I guess a party of maybe 4. That is if they walk like we do and don't have 4 feet. Brady smiled when he said it. Okay, let's get the early warning perimeter set up and make sure the PV toll still works. Looks like we need to be proactive. PV toll is fine. The only damage we really suffered was to the ship itself. What about the laser rifles? Is everyone trained? Yes. Then issue them. I don't want to be surprised by an angry group of life forms who more than likely will not understand anything we say. Brady smiled. You know, Skipper, if you speak English slow enough, everyone understands it. Shaking his head, O'Neill said, You've been watching way too many 20th century videos, Jack. Chuckling, the mission specialist hurried away to tend to his task, leaving O'Neill and Carol near the footprints. She looked down at them. Why does a life form on a planet 40 light years from Earth have a foot that looks identical to ours? I don't know, Carol. Maybe we should ask Renee. Renee Weaver examined the image of the footprint. Damn, looks identical, doesn't it? O'Neill let the question go unanswered. You know, Skipper, there was a theory floating around about a century ago which suggested our galaxy might have been seeded by an ancient spacefaring race of humanoids. What kind of seeds? DNA, actually. You think this proves the theory? I didn't say that, I just mentioned it. Until we see one of these individuals, I'm not speculating what they may look like. This damn planet was supposed to be uninhabited. She looked up at the flight commander. You keep saying that. Obviously, it is. Yes, but we haven't seen evidence of any large mammals or reptiles. Evolution doesn't work that way, Renee. Then there has to be another explanation. He folded his arms. I'm listening. Speculation. If that's what you've got, talk to me. 140 years ago, the Chinese were rumored to have launched an experimental faster-than-light spaceship from the dark side of the moon. They kept it a secret, and few details were known. I personally don't buy the story, but there were some who did. Actually, they launched a lot of missions from their base on the far side. Although they were supposedly sublight and restricted to our solar system, the base was abandoned about 2 decades ago when the current hyperdrive propulsion engines were introduced. Well, there you go, Skipper. Maybe these are the descendants of that mission. If they are, Carol might be able to communicate with them. Why do you say that? She speaks Mandarin. On the 6th day of their trek, a warrior who had been sent ahead to scout appeared before them, breathless and showing burn marks on his arm. Denali asked, "Why are you hurt, Mika?" "A great lightning bolt struck me. There were no clouds in the sky." The head warrior started to say something, but Dakota placed his hand on the tall man's arm. "Did this bolt come from the sky or the earth, Mika?" The man stared at the medicine man, his eyes wide. "From the ground." Dakota nodded. "Can you take us to this place?" Turning, the still out-of-breath man pointed. "At the top of that highland, about a half a day's walk." The medicine man remained quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "We are close, Denali." He looked up at the rise of land before him. "I have been to this place before. At the top of that rise is an expansive plateau. We will find answers to our questions there." Paul Weaver hovered the PV toll at an altitude of 100 meters while Jack Brady scanned the land below for intruders. His methodical scans of the terrain with the binoculars suddenly stopped. Weaver noticed him concentrating on one specific area. "Do you see something, Jack?" "Movement halfway down the slope." "Want me to get closer?" "Yeah, take us down 50 meters. The hovering vehicle grew closer to the ground when Brady suddenly motioned for Weaver to take it back up. "What is it?" 14 men, dark-skinned, who look like they come from an island in the South Pacific. "Are they armed?" "Bows and arrows are all I saw." "How far from the security perimeter?" "Maybe half a click." "Did they see us?" "Yeah, one of them pointed directly at the PV toll." "Time to tell the skipper. I'm heading back." Brady only nodded as he kept his concentration on the advancing men. Dakota pointed at the strange object floating over the plateau. "We have been discovered." Denali turned in the direction the medicine man indicated. A sense of fear nibbled at the base of his brain when he heard gasps from some of the men behind him. One cried out, "The Great Spirit will protect us, won't it?" "Yes, my brothers. We also have our medicine man with us. He too will protect us." Dakota kept his concentration on the object as it flew north, away from where he stood. He turned to Denali. "I am not sure the Great Spirit can protect us against men powerful enough to fly." Denali stared at his older companion. "I saw no men, just a large machine." The front part of the object was transparent. I saw 2 men, similar in appearance to us. He stood still and continued to gaze at the top of the plateau. "Denali, make sure your warriors have fresh water and something to eat. I will explore and try to determine who these men are." "No, Dakota. I will go instead." With a smile, the older man shook his head. "It will be all right. Protect your men. I must know more about this flying machine before I place any of you in harm's way." After climbing to the top of the rise, Dakota noticed a shiny pole with a green light blinking on the top. He stopped several meters away and studied it. Picking up a rock, he tossed it toward the pole. With a crackling sound, the rock stopped even with the pole and fell to the ground. That's what caused Mika's burn. He looked further and saw another pole. Staying outside what he considered an invisible fence, Dakota started walking again toward what he knew lay beyond. The events of the past few days caused him to remember a warning heard from the Ancient Ones many years ago. They foretold that their ancestors would find them one day. O'Neill watched the older man approach the outside of the security fence. He walked with his hands at his side, his left hand using a large walking stick. His clothing appeared to be made of a woven material and draped over his slender frame. His hair was long on the sides and pulled into a ponytail in the back. His facial features reminded the flight commander of someone from the Pacific Rim on Earth. He stopped and raised his right hand. He spoke, but O'Neill did not understand. Carol said, "I think he said he is not a threat." Mandarin? A mangled version of it? So the rumor may be true. This could be what's left of the Chinese experimental spaceship. Can you ask him his name? I'll try, but I might be asking for a soup recipe. She said something and waited for the man's response. Dakota. O'Neill heard multiple swishing sounds high overhead above the protection of the security fence. He reacted by protecting Carol with his body and looking back toward his crew. He noticed their weapons pointed toward his right and firing just as arrows struck their targets. Jack Brady and Paul Weaver stiffened as arrows embedded in their chests. Both men grimaced but remained standing. They trained their weapons on targets to O'Neill's right and continued to fire. Nina Webb collapsed with an arrow through her upper torso. O'Neill withdrew his weapon as he looked in the direction of his team's fire. At least 12 warriors, similar in appearance to Dakota, collapsed, all suffering from massive damage from the weapons burning huge holes in their torsos. Moving his handgun toward the old man, he saw horror in his expression as he watched his warriors collapse and die from the laser fire. A tall man, his right arm missing, started running toward O'Neill screaming. He ran into the security barrier and burst into flames. The carnage subsided, and the flight commander aimed his weapon at the old man just outside the electronic fence. The only survivor now displayed a mask of grief. O'Neill said to Carol, "Ask him why they attacked." She spoke and saw the old man return his gaze toward them. He emitted sounds. The length of time between his words and Carol's translation seemed like an eternity. "They were following my orders. Forgive me. I only now understand who you are." O'Neill turned to check on his crew. Jack and Paul were now prone on the ground. He felt the carotid artery of each and then closed his eyes when he felt Nina's. "They're all dead." He pointed his handgun at the old man again. "Ask him why I should not kill him where he stands." Carol mumbled a few words and the old man nodded. He spoke and Carol translated. "You have every right to do so, but I can show you to a ship that will take you home." 4 months later. The ancient ship, found in a hangar carved out of rock on a mountain, took a month for O'Neill and Carol to prepare for takeoff. Now, after 12 weeks of acceleration, it approached what many physicists claimed was an unbreakable wall. Carol looked up from the flight controls of the Chinese spaceship and said to O'Neill, "It appears we will reach the speed of light and then accelerate beyond, once we're through the barrier." That is what the AI program Dakota called the Ancient One explained. He turned to Renee Weaver. "How long will it take to get back to Earth once we cross the barrier?" "The passage of time will slow for us as we reach and exceed the speed of light. Once we cross the light speed barrier, it will seem more like 3 or 4 months from our perspective. On Earth, time will pass normally. I'm guessing we will get home a few years before our SOS message reaches them." O'Neill took a deep breath. "I'm sorry Paul is not with us." "Yes, so am I." Carol said, "Dakota told me he knew the planet was dying. The Ancient Ones told him his ancestors would someday find his tribe, reveal the truth, and take them home. Apparently, he was also told about this ship, but didn't know its location until a recent earthquake. I'm glad we were able to rescue the remaining survivors of his tribe." She turned to her husband. "Why did Dakota remain behind?" "I don't know. You were the last one to speak to him." "What he said didn't make sense." "What was it?" "All of life is dreamwalking. All of death is going home." O'Neill nodded. "It's an ancient Chinese proverb, one I heard numerous times before we left on Hermes. His mission was over. He saved his people. Now, he could rest."
Chilling tales for dark nights.